Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. It started with the ceiling. I woke up at some point in the dark and lay there thinking I'd heard the house settle. Old cabins do that, but the underside of the roof didn't groan. Instead, there were shadows moving above me, like someone was passing a flashlight between their knees. Slow arcs, no hard edges, as if long arms were sweeping across the plaster. I sat up, pulled the blanket tighter, and listened. There was no wind, no rain, not even the far sound of a car. The curtains were closed over the single window. They were the heavy kind, lined, thick, meant to keep the cold out. The little brass latch was still locked. Nothing on the porch could have made shadows that big. I'm Rachel. I was alone in a rental cabin up in the Catskills for the week because my apartment in the city felt like someone else's life and I needed something that didn't hum. The place was small, a wood stove, a kitchenette that had seen better days, books stacked like they were leaning for moral support. I'd picked it because the photos showed trees close enough to the windows to touch and a creak you could hear in the background. The first night, everything was normal in a way that made normal feel like a privilege. I ate cold pizza, read a little, fell asleep to the thin cough of the stove. When the shadows started their quiet patrol across the ceiling, I waited for an obvious answer. Maybe the streetlight down the road was brighter that night. Maybe a neighbor had a spotlight. I told myself I'd be rational. I padded to the curtain, felt the latch, and wheeled the knob. It was locked, as I remembered, and the glass was dark and not showing headlights or any moving shape. The trees outside were thick and still. Their branches didn't tap the pane. The night was the kind that used to make me feel like a child, soft and enfolding. This thing felt different. It felt like someone had taken the ordinary night, cut a hole in it, and was shuffling cards through the gap. I turned on the bedside lamp. The shadows didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to move more distinctly against the patch of ceiling that the lamp didn't reach. That was the first time a real stupid fear made my mouth go dry. An image of someone, not a person exactly, but a shape, between the roof and the sky, playing with light. I clicked the lamp off again, and the ceiling went to the neutral dark everyone knows. Maybe I dozed off on my book and dreamed it. Maybe. I lay there for a while, and then, because I'm not brave, and because I like evidence, I got up and opened the door quietly. The hallway outside the bedroom smelled faintly of wood smoke, the kind that still felt like a promise rather than a threat. The rest of the cabin was dark. The kitchen clock glowed faintly. 2:13 a.m. The stovepipe clanked once like a polite horse, then settled. I padded to the living room where there's a second door that opens onto a small porch. The curtains there were also closed. I eased one aside and looked out into the night. Between the trunks of the pines, there was a pale light drifting low, about treetop height. It wasn't bright, more awash, like the skin of a moonless night lit by something clean and white. It hovered between the trunks and moved slowly from one gap in the trees to the next, as if someone carrying a lantern were walking along a path I couldn't see. There was no sound, no footsteps on gravel, no engine. Nothing. The light didn't have a source you could point to. It was a liquid thing, rounder than a flashlight and smoother than a headlamp. It didn't flicker. It just drifted, and the way it crossed the trunks made long, soft shadows on the snow-dusted forest floor. I remember standing there with the curtain pinched between my fingers and feeling stupid for being afraid. There are a lot of things you can get used to in upstate New York. Deer in the yard, coyotes at dusk, people who lose their way and knock on the wrong cabin door, but this didn't fit. I grabbed my phone to take a picture, and the screen stuttered like a hiccup and then showed me the camera menu, as if I just opened it. No preview. I tapped to take a picture, and the shutter sound froze halfway through, and then the file wouldn't save. My phone battery dropped visibly. Not 3%, then 2%. It dropped like a mini syndrome. It read 17% when the light was a few feet from the porch, and 9% after it slid past the far pines. That made me fourth guess myself. Was the battery terrible? Had I remembered the charge wrong? Even that felt like a small symptom of something else. For the next 20 minutes, I watched from the doorway. The light drifted along a line I couldn't trace, between trees, then back, then hesitated and swept slow arcs. The way the light moved made me think of someone reading the trunks like book pages, scanning them without touching. Eventually, it angled toward the creek and then vanished behind a thicker stand of birch. I watched until I couldn't see any pale glow at all, then eased the curtain shut and got back into bed, hands shaking. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I lay awake thinking of insect noises that had stopped, the chirp of crickets, the far call of a barred owl. The yard had been too quiet when the light was there. Like all the small life had paused the way you pause a record. Once, sometime after 3, I heard another thing. A single soft scrape near the side door, like someone dragging a foot over the gravel. I froze and listened, and then the scrape stopped. There was no second scrape and no sound of any vehicle pulling away. I didn't open the door. In the morning, the cabin looked normal in the harsh way things do after a night of oddness. Sun filtered through the curtains the same as always. The wood stove needed another stick of kindling. The coffee maker took too long to warm up. I tried to be practical. Check the lock, check the windows, call the owner. The deadbolt and the latch on the porch were both in place just as I'd left them. There was no physical evidence of someone having been up on the roof or outside the house. But when I walked the perimeter with my sneakers and stood on the porch, there were impressions in the moss on the far side, shallow and too neat to be deer prints. They were almost like the outline of a boot but softer, as if whatever had made them had weight but not a heel. They started at the rock slab and trailed off into the ferns. I took two pictures. The camera on my phone showed plain green and then a corrupted speck where the impressions were. I told the owner what I'd seen, and he laughed the cautious laugh of someone with property to protect. Probably a neighbor with one of those LED lanterns, he said, or some kids messing about. He offered to come up with a spare flashlight and to check his motion lights. I found myself not taking comfort in his explanation. The person I had seen in my doorway that night, if it had been a person, would have had to walk through a stretch of pines no one uses and not leave a proper trail. And the scratches, small, like the drag of something round, were the wrong shape for human feet. I stayed another night because I'm stubborn about plans and because, half meanly, I wanted to prove to myself it had been nothing. The second night was full of other strange little things that accumulated like beads on a string. My kitchen radio, which usually picks up distant NPR clear as a bell, shimmered into static for a full minute and then came back on with a different host mid-sentence. The dog of a neighbor 2 cabins down barked hard at 1:45 a.m. and then didn't bark again for hours. My analog alarm clock reset itself to 12 at some time between midnight and dawn. By 3 in the morning, I was awake again. This time, when the shadows started across the bedroom ceiling, it felt like being under observation rather than in a story. The shape of the shadow was wrong, too long, and too slow. I turned on every light in the cabin, the kitchen, the living room, the sconces. The shadows still slid above like something outside had a strip of white paper and was running it gently across the roof. The lamp over the stove hummed and briefly dimmed, then brightened as if someone had changed a dial. My phone buzzed with one text from an unknown number that only read, "You should leave." There was no signature. I called the number and it went straight to voicemail. I packed my bag before dawn. I didn't tell the owner I was leaving early because the explanation I would have given, the cabin felt watched and the trees had footprints that weren't quite boots, sounded foolish in the polite light of morning. The drive down the mountain was slow because the road was narrow, and I kept glancing in the rear view at the trees. They looked normal enough. Trunks standing in a row, little branches catching sunlight. In the car, my phone booted itself 3 times like it had to reinitialize, and the battery settled back to what it had been when I'd left the city. I called my sister, who likes practical questions, and said I'd had a strange night. She asked if I'd had too much wine. I told her about the light and the ceiling and the soft prints. She told me to get home and not to go back. I did go home. The city noise is its own smothering thing, but it felt easier to live with than that dense, quiet attention in the woods. I slept in my bed properly that night, the city skyline throwing orange bands into my curtains, and I didn't see shadows crawl across any ceilings. I've told a few people, a friend from grad school who wants to believe in mysteries, and my neighbor who says it was probably a deer with a reflective collar, and neither had an answer. The only thing that stuck was how precise the moments were. A light that skimmed between trunks, shadows moving like slow hands, the odd small failures of electronics, the little trail of impressions that wasn't human. I could have chalked it up to nerves, to the loneliness of a week alone, to a battery dying at the wrong time. I could have accepted the owner's lantern theory, but the print shapes, the hum of the lamp in the kitchen, the way my phone dropped power faster when the light was near, those details sat in my head, sharp and small. I went back 2 months later with a friend who swore she wanted to see the place for herself. We walked the perimeter in daylight and found only normal things. Moss, a fox trail, the same rounded rocks. The impressions I'd seen had washed into the ground. The owner had installed a motion light that clicked on reliably when we tramped past. There was nothing left to make me certain of anything I hadn't lived. We sat on the porch with mugs and watched the trees. The air moved. The cabin was quiet in a regular way. Sometimes in the city, late when the building hums and the neighbor's radiator rattles like an old train, I'll stand at my window and look out at the line of apartment windows across the street and wonder what the house near the pines contains. I don't think I want that light to visit me again. I don't think I want whatever made those perfect slow shadows to come close. But a part of me, small and stubborn, still wonders what it was doing scanning the trees, what it read in the bark, and why it bothered to move the way it did. I made it home safe. I packed my bag. The details of that week stay with me in the practical, nagging way of things you can't quite put down. I was finishing my rounds at the Ticonderoga Lighthouse just before midnight, the summer air sticky and thick with the scent of Lake Champlain. The wind had picked up more than usual and the lake was choppy, the waves slapping the rocks below the lighthouse in steady, uneven rhythm. I had just checked the generator and the backup light panels, making sure everything was running smoothly before I settled in for the night. That's when I saw it. It was hovering a few 100 feet offshore, maybe 50 feet above the water, and it was glowing, like a reflection off the lake or the lighthouse itself, but a solid, pale white light, spherical, like someone had hung a globe in the air. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't moving like a drone or a helicopter. The wind was gusting, the lake tossing spray into the night, and that thing just stayed there, almost anchored with no visible means of support. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it might be a buoy, some light from a boat, or a reflection from a passing car on the distant Route 74. But the closer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't behaving like any of those things. The light didn't flicker, and it moved against the wind in a slow, almost deliberate drift. I grabbed my binoculars from the shelf and aimed at it. No seams, no panels, no rotors, just a perfect, glowing sphere. I tried the VHF radio, calling out to the few vessels I knew were on the lake at that hour. Echo Bravo, this is the Ticonderoga Lighthouse. Do you copy? Nothing. Static. I called again, this time to the Coast Guard frequency, just in case. Still nothing. Not a single response. I checked the AIS system, none of the boats near the sphere, none on radar, nothing showing up. That made the hair on my neck stand up. The sphere drifted closer, but it didn't feel threatening, at least not like it was going to crash into the lighthouse or anything. But it was unnerving. It moved smoothly, silently, against the gusts, as if the wind didn't exist. I stepped out onto the lighthouse balcony, gripping the railing, and the whole night felt different. The fog had started rolling in from the north, thin at first, then thick enough that it was starting to catch the light from the sphere, giving the whole lake an eerie, glowing haze. I took out my phone. I tried snapping a photo. The light was so bright and pure it overexposed the lens, leaving just a white orb against a gray blur. Frustrated, I tried video. The orb moved a little, drifting slowly west, sliding across the water. I could see the faint reflections on the small waves, but none of the ripples seemed to interact with it, like it wasn't part of the world at all. Then I noticed something stranger. The fog wasn't just around the sphere. It seemed to stretch and distort slightly in its wake, as if it was moving through a pocket of air that the rest of the world didn't enter. And the sound, the lake, the wind, the waves, had dropped almost completely. Not just a little, but like someone had turned the volume down. The breeze was still gusting on the lighthouse balcony, my hair whipping in my face, but the distant lapping and crash of water on the rocks below seemed muted, almost hollow. I went back inside and tried to call the Coast Guard again, describing the object, asking if they had radar or any sightings. Nothing. No acknowledgement, not even a hint that I wasn't imagining it. My heart was thudding, and I felt a weird mixture of awe and anxiety. I kept watching it through the big lighthouse window. It drifted closer still, sliding slowly along the lake's surface, perfectly level, perfectly round. After a while, I noticed that time didn't feel normal. I'd looked at my watch when I first saw it, 11:47 p.m., and by the time I realized I had spent what felt like an hour watching, my watch read 11:55. 8 minutes had passed, but it felt longer, like time had stretched in the presence of that thing. I shook my head, thinking fatigue or stress. I had been on shift for hours, alone in the tower, and it was dark, silent, strange, and wet outside. But the object was real, I was sure of that. At one point, I stepped back onto the balcony to get a better angle, and I swear I felt it move slightly toward me, not directly, not like it was attacking, but like it was aware of my presence. I froze, gripping the railing, and for a moment it drifted sideways, closer to the lighthouse itself. Then, without warning, it shot upward at an angle against the wind, faster than anything I'd ever seen, disappearing into the clouds above in a straight, smooth trajectory. No sound, no trail, nothing but the faint glow fading into the night. The lake immediately seemed normal again. The fog thinned, the wind returned to its usual rustle, and the waves slapped the rocks with ordinary rhythm. My ears popped, my pulse finally settled, and I stood there for a long time, staring at nothing but the dark, empty water. I checked the AIS again, radioed the vessels one last time. Still nothing. I went back inside, sat at the small desk by the light controls, and tried to shake it off. It didn't make sense. There were no aircraft nearby, no satellites, no drones that could move like that, silently and without disturbance. My mind kept replaying the movement, the shape, the way the fog had distorted. It was wrong, and right at the same time, as if it was familiar in some way I couldn't place. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little creak of the lighthouse, every gust of wind against the windows made me tense. I kept thinking I'd see it again, floating against the wind, perfect and silent. I told no one for weeks, just kept quiet, not wanting to sound crazy. Occasionally, I called a friend who works on boats in the area, trying to see if they'd noticed anything unusual. They hadn't. Nobody had. Weeks later, I still look out across the lake when the fog rolls in at night. I check the horizon for that pale glow, and sometimes I think I see a faint reflection or a shimmer in the mist, just for a moment, gone before I can focus. And I keep thinking about how it moved against the wind, how it ignored everything else in the world, and how, for 8 or 10 minutes, my perception of time and space bent just a little. I've been back at the lighthouse many nights since. No sphere, no strange lights, nothing. Just the wind, the lake, the fog rolling over the rocks. But sometimes, when the fog is thick and the night is still, I can't help checking the horizon, watching the lake, waiting for the impossible to appear again. I was finishing the final approach into Plattsburgh International one late summer night, flying a small Cessna 172. It was around 10:45 p.m., clear skies, warm enough that I didn't need a jacket in the cockpit. I had the runway in sight for a straight-in approach, and the airport was mostly quiet. No commercial traffic scheduled, just me and a couple of private planes in the pattern earlier in the evening. I noticed it first as a kind of shimmer near the runway lights, a pale, almost silvery glint that didn't seem to belong. At first, I thought it was the reflection of my own cockpit instruments on the canopy, or maybe a lens flare off the runway lighting. But then it shifted slightly, and my stomach gave that weird little twist you get when something doesn't feel right. It was hovering maybe 50 feet above the far end of the main runway, completely still, completely silent. I could see it against the dark tarmac and the dim perimeter lights. The shape didn't make sense, kind of a rounded oval, but edges too smooth, too precise to be any aircraft I'd ever seen. No wings, no tail, no landing gear visible. I called Plattsburgh Tower, assuming someone else had seen it, maybe a maintenance vehicle or a balloon. Plattsburgh Tower, Cessna 4RXY on final. Do you copy? The radio crackled back. Go ahead, 4RXY. I told them what I was seeing, gave a rough location. There was static for a beat, and then the controller said, Cessna, we're not picking up anything unusual on radar. All runways clear. That made the hair on my neck stand up. I looked again, and the thing had shifted maybe 10 feet laterally. It didn't move like a bird, like a plane, like a drone. It just seemed to float, adjusting position in almost jerky, unnatural increments. I tried a tighter turn, banking slightly to get a different angle, and it stayed perfectly centered above the runway lights. I kept talking to the tower, trying to keep my voice normal, explaining that it seemed to move slightly when I changed my position, but it wasn't accelerating or making any sound. Are you visual? The controller asked. Yes. I can see it perfectly. Looks metallic, reflective, almost like a mirror, I said. The word came out weird, almost laughing at how ridiculous it sounded. Then suddenly, it was gone. I mean, completely gone. I blinked, adjusted my view, looked back at the runway. Nothing. No object, no light, no shimmer. I called the tower immediately, heart thumping. Tower, it's gone. I don't see it anymore. Copy, 4XY. No contacts showing on radar. Runway clear. I circled once, keeping my eyes peeled, but the air felt heavier, somehow. Like there was still something in the space around the runway, but it wasn't visible anymore. The engines sounded normal, the wind was calm, everything in the cockpit fine, but my stomach was tied in knots. I landed, rolled to the tie-down area, and shut down the engine. That's when I noticed it. A faint smell in the air, sharp and electrical, like ozone after a thunderstorm, but no storm had passed recently. It was subtle, not strong, but unmistakable. I walked around the plane slowly, looking up and down the runway, the perimeter lights casting long, soft shadows across the tarmac. Nothing. I called my friend, Mike, another private pilot, just to get someone's opinion. You didn't see a UFO, did you? He said, half joking. I told him what happened in detail. He paused, then said, Ozone, hovering, no sound, disappeared? That's weird, man. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I couldn't leave it there, so I filed a quick flight log entry, noting the time, approximate location, description, and the faint ozone smell. I didn't want to overstate it. I'm a pilot, not a storyteller, but it felt important to record it somehow. Driving home, the sky had a faint orange glow over the lake to the east, and the air still smelled faintly of that same sharp, clean scent. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see some glint or shimmer following me. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched, or maybe just observed, lingered longer than it should have. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it hovering, perfectly still, waiting, almost like it was watching me watch it. The thing is, there was no way to explain it. No lights on radar, no sound, nothing moving. And yet, I could still picture it perfectly. The smooth metallic surface, the hovering motion, and the way it just disappeared into thin air. I flew again a few nights later, same plane, same airport, hoping to catch some clue, some explanation. Nothing. The perimeter lights were dull and boring, the runway empty, the air smelled normal. I haven't seen anything like it since, but I think about every time I fly over the lake, every time I land at night, and sometimes when the air is still and the runway lights are just so, I swear I catch a flicker in the corner of my eye. Not enough to see it clearly, but enough to make my stomach knot up like that night. I don't talk about it much. I don't want people thinking I'm embellishing, but I know what I saw. The smell, the way it hovered, the way it vanished when I tried to get a better angle. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a balloon, it wasn't a reflection. It was something else, something I still can't explain. And even writing this now, I can almost feel it above the runway, waiting just beyond the edge of perception. Every time I tell the story to a fellow pilot, they ask about radar, they ask about weather, they ask if I was tired. All valid questions, but none of them fit. The night was clear, the radar clean, I was wide awake. It wasn't a trick of the mind, I know that. And I'll keep flying, because that's what I do. But every late night approach into Plattsburgh, I can't help glancing at the far end of the runway, just in case it decides to show up again. I pulled my boat into a quiet bend along the St. Lawrence River just as dusk was fading. The sky was thick with clouds, low enough to make the far shore look like a shadow. I'd been fishing here for years, sometimes staying until late, but that night felt different from the moment I stepped onto the river. There was a stillness that went beyond calm water. Even the usual chorus of frogs and night birds seemed muted, like they were holding their breath. I pushed off the dock, motor humming softly, and let the current drift me toward a section I liked where the river curved into a small cove. My fishing poles were ready, tackle organized, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd been alone for maybe 20 minutes, adjusting the lines and watching the water ripple gently, when I noticed something odd. The surface ahead of me shifted in a perfect circle, concentric ripples spreading outward like someone had dropped a stone. But the water was flat and I hadn't thrown anything. I leaned over the edge of the boat, shining my flashlight across the dark water, expecting to see a log, a deer, maybe even a floating piece of debris. Nothing. I shrugged it off at first, blaming the current or an odd reflection of the clouds. But then it happened again, almost immediately. Another set of ripples, perfectly round, forming slowly like the water itself was being pushed up from below. I froze. My hands were gripping the edge of the boat without realizing it. The ripples moved, expanded, and then stopped, leaving the river perfectly still again. I sat back in the boat, heart thumping, telling myself I was just tired, imagining things after a long day of work. Then I noticed the glow. At first, I thought it was a reflection from the lights of the far shore, but it didn't move with the clouds or change with the water. It hovered just above the rippling circle, faint, pale, almost like a weak moon trapped in the mist. No sound, not a hum or buzz, nothing, just this soft floating light. I leaned forward, squinting. The orb didn't seem to have a solid shape, not perfectly round, but not irregular either. It floated maybe 3 or 4 feet above the water, directly over the ripples. I raised my flashlight, flicking it across the orb, expecting it to scatter or reflect. Instead, it jerked slightly upward, like it had felt the light, then hovered again. I couldn't make sense of it. I reached for my phone to call the local marina, maybe see if anyone else had seen anything, but the signal was gone, as expected this far out. I called out softly, "Hello? Anyone there?" The water swallowed my voice. I was alone, completely alone, and the orb didn't respond. But something about the way it hovered made me feel like it was aware I was there. I tried to move closer, paddling quietly, keeping the flashlight steady, but the moment I neared the circle of ripples, the orb suddenly accelerated straight upward. No sound, no disturbance in the air, nothing but a streak of faint light disappearing into the cloud cover. I blinked, and it was gone. The water was still again, completely flat, no ripples, no trace of movement. I sat frozen, gripping the edge of the boat. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I'd just seen. 100 possible explanations ran through me. Bioluminescent algae, a drifting lantern, a trick of the clouds, even a fishing buoy, but none fit. Not the precision of the ripples, not the way the light moved, not the silence. I stayed on the river for a while longer, scanning the water with the flashlight. Nothing. Every shadow looked like it could hide the orb returning. Every wavelet seemed too deliberate. Eventually, I started heading back to the dock, motor quiet, trying to keep calm. The ripples never returned, the mist stayed thick, and the river felt heavier than usual, like it remembered what had happened. When I got back to the dock, I noticed small, circular depressions in the mud where the boat had floated, almost perfectly round. They weren't just from the hull. It was subtle, but they were arranged in a way that made me hesitate, like something had been beneath the boat and risen. I knelt down, pressed my fingers into one. Cool, damp, ordinary mud. But still, the impression was too neat, too intentional to be from waves alone. I told Elise about it when I got home. She nodded, wide-eyed, but quiet. I could tell she thought I was shaken, maybe imagining things, but I wasn't. I'd been fishing on this river for years, alone at night, and I'd never seen anything remotely like this. I've gone back to that bend since a few times during the day and at night, but I haven't seen the ripples, the orb, nothing. I thought maybe it had just been a rare phenomenon, an odd trick of the water and light. But sometimes when the wind is calm and the mist drifts low over the river, I swear I can feel it. The weight of being watched, the sense that something could emerge again just beyond my sight. I don't sleep on the river anymore. I stick to the edges where the lights of the town reach, where I can call out and someone might answer. I fish. I enjoy the quiet, but that night hangs with me. The ripples, the orb, the silent rise into the clouds. I can't explain it. I can only remember it, and every time I do, I imagine that faint light hovering just above the water, waiting, watching, then disappearing as if it was never there at all. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes drive past the river at night, glancing over at the bend. I see only darkness and mist, but I feel the memory of the light, and I wonder if it's still there, just beyond reach, in the same perfect circle on the water, silent. I was finishing the night shift at a security company in Buffalo, covering one of the older industrial parks along Riverside Drive. It's mostly empty warehouses now, a few of them rented out for storage, some abandoned for years. My routine was simple: walk the perimeter every hour, check cameras, make notes, radio in every so often. Usually uneventful, and I preferred it that way. It was mid-September, one of those nights where the air is cool but humid, with a low cloud ceiling that made everything feel dim and pressed down. The streets outside were deserted, except for the occasional truck. Around 1:15 a.m., I was in the main office, reviewing the live feeds from cameras mounted on the roofs. I remember drinking my last cup of coffee and noticing that everything looked normal. Empty lots, a few blinking lights on the rooftops, shadows stretching from the old street lamps. Then I saw it. Camera 5, the one covering the north side of the complex, showed a bright light coming down over Warehouse 12. At first, I thought it was a reflection from one of the lampposts or maybe a truck's headlights, but there was nothing on the street. The light hovered just above the roof, completely still, and it wasn't yellow or white like normal bulbs. It was almost bluish-white, soft at the edges but intense in the middle, like someone had jammed a flashlight into a fog. I froze. I watched it for a good 30 seconds before I grabbed my radio to check with dispatch. "You seeing this?" I said, keeping my voice calm. No response. They must have been busy at another post. I called the front desk line. No answer. I realized I was alone in the building. The light pulsed once, then twice, very slowly, like it was breathing. I reached for the zoom on the camera, trying to get a closer look. The footage jumped a little, static interference maybe. But the light remained. What got me was that there was no source, no wires, no vehicle, no anything. The warehouse roof underneath was dark, nothing moving. I thought about heading outside to see it with my own eyes, but the feeling I can only describe as wrong hit me. It wasn't fear exactly, just uneasy, like the hairs on your arms standing up when something is off. I stayed inside and kept watching. After maybe 2 minutes, the light started to move. Not fast. It drifted a few feet forward, then hovered again. Then, without warning, it seemed to disappear frame by frame on the monitor. 1 second it was there, the next, fainter, then gone. I paused the feed and rewound it. Every frame I went back, it was the same, pulsing slightly, then fading. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the north exit, curiosity winning over caution. When I stepped outside, the parking lot was dark. The lamps overhead flickered from the humid air, and there was nothing, no glow, no noise, nothing. The buildings were empty, the ground dry, not a puddle or disturbance. I walked along the edge of Warehouse 12, shining the beam over the roof and walls. Nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no evidence of anyone being there. The air smelled like ozone, though faint, just enough to notice if you stopped breathing for a moment. I don't think it lasted more than 30 seconds, but I remember stopping and just breathing, trying to process it. When I turned back to the office, my radio crackled. Dispatch was back online, asking if I was okay. I said yes, trying to keep my voice casual and didn't mention the light. I went back inside, rewound the camera feed again. I noticed something else, the timestamp. The light had been on camera for about 2 minutes, maybe a little more. I checked the wall clock. I had lost maybe 20 minutes. I don't know if I dozed off or what, but the sequence of events didn't match the clock. Trying to explain it rationally, I thought maybe it was a reflection, maybe an aircraft. But the light was too low for planes, and the airport radar shows nothing. Helicopters would make noise. Drones? Possible, but there's no way one could hover so close to those roofs without being noticed by anyone else, especially without lights or a sound. I kept an eye on the feed the rest of the night. Nothing else appeared. The rest of my rounds were quiet. I did my checks, wrote up the incident report in my log, only noting strange light on camera, no source identified, and headed home at 5:30 a.m. That morning, when I walked out to my car, the fog from the river hung low over the asphalt. The whole industrial park looked the same: old warehouses, cracked concrete, empty. I stopped at the gate for a moment, half expecting to see that blue-white glow again, but it never came. I tried telling my friend Greg, another guard, what happened. He laughed it off, said I was probably tired or seeing reflections. But when I showed him the footage, he got quiet. He said he didn't know what to make of it, but he agreed it was weird, the pulsing, the way it disappeared. I've gone back to that post a few times since, always at night, nothing. Cameras are fine, rounds are fine. I watch for the light, half hoping, half dreading it. Sometimes, when the mist rolls in from the river, I swear I catch a faint shimmer in the corner of my eye, just enough to make me pause, but it's gone before I can focus. I haven't told anyone else at work. Don't want them thinking I'm crazy. I keep the footage on my phone, but every time I look at it, I get that same uneasy feeling. It's like the light knows I'm watching, even if it's not really there anymore. The thing is, I'm not sure if I want to see it again. But at the same time, I can't stop thinking about it. That soft, pulsing, hovering glow in the middle of the empty warehouses, the way time seemed to stretch. It's one of those nights that just lingers. I still drive past Riverside Drive sometimes, late at night. The industrial park looks ordinary, dark, empty, silent. But every so often when the fog rolls in, I swear I see something flicker between the buildings. I tell myself it's just a trick of the lights, a reflection, my imagination. But I don't think it is. Not entirely. It was around 2 in the morning when I first noticed it. I work nights at the CSX yard on the west side of Syracuse, over by the tracks that run past Getty Street. I'd been doing maintenance shifts there for about 3 years, mostly checking couplers, running brake tests, that kind of thing. The yard's not exactly busy at that hour, most of the freight's stationary, and it's just a few of us moving around in reflective vests under the floodlights. That night was clear, but cold. Early March when the snow's half melted, but the air still bites your skin. The wind off the Onondaga Lake comes through those yards like a knife. I remember because I'd been using one of those little propane hand warmers in my coat pocket, and it had already gone out. I was walking between 2 rows of tank cars, heading toward the east end to recheck a stuck handbrake. It was quiet, except for the usual distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional clank of metal cooling. The kind of silence that's never complete, but close enough to make you hear your own breathing. The first thing that caught my attention was how dark it was between 2 of the cars ahead of me. The yard lights spill over almost everything. There's always some glow, even under the cars, but in that one gap, it was just black. Not like a shadow, more like a space where the light stopped existing. It looked wrong, too clean-edged, like a section of the world had been cut out. I thought maybe it was my eyes adjusting from looking at my phone, so I blinked a few times and walked closer. That's when I realized the darkness wasn't staying still. It was shifting, slowly, like something was moving between the cars. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no metallic creaks, nothing brushing the gravel. Just this sense that something was there, big enough to block light but quiet as air. I called out, "Hey, anyone over there?" Because sometimes guys from the next shift come early and mess around. No answer. The dark shape didn't move away, it just adjusted again. It slid a few feet to the right, still between the cars, still perfectly silent. I started to think maybe it was smoke from one of the old engines that had been idling earlier. That's the only thing that made sense. So I took a few steps closer, shining my flashlight toward it. The beam just stopped, didn't reflect, didn't scatter, just ended. like it hit something completely matte. I backed up without realizing it, my boots crunching on the ballast. I kept expecting to hear someone laugh or yell gotcha, but the whole yard was dead quiet. After a minute, I radioed into my coworker Mark, who was on the far end of the yard near the switch controls. I told him I thought someone was between the cars and that I was going to check it out. He grumbled, said he'd head my way. While I waited, I kept the flashlight steady on that black gap. It didn't move anymore, just sat there. I swear it looked like it was absorbing the light. I know that sounds stupid, but there wasn't even a glint off the steel where the beam hit. It was like looking into a hole. Then, just before Mark's light came into view from the other side of the line, the darkness shifted again, this time fast. It sort of pulled upward, like it lifted itself between the cars and vanished into the air, not up into the sky. Just gone, like it folded into the night. By the time Mark got there, I was standing maybe 20 feet from where it had been. I told him I'd seen someone or something move through the cars, but when we both checked, there was nothing. No footprints, no scuff marks, nothing disturbed in the snow-dusted gravel. That's when we noticed how cold the metal was. The tank car nearest where the shape had been, number 533821, I remember it clear, was coated with a thin layer of frost. Everything else around it was just wet from melting snow, but that one car looked like it had been sitting in a freezer. I touched it through my glove and still felt it sting through the fabric. Mark touched it too, then frowned and said, "What the hell? It's 28 out, not 10. We checked the adjacent cars and they were normal, only that one section was freezing cold. We stood there a while, not sure what to make of it. He asked if I was sure it wasn't steam or exhaust. I told him it didn't move like that. There was no haze, no edges, just perfect black, like the light itself stopped working there. He shrugged it off, said maybe it was an optical thing. But as we walked away, I noticed his breath clouding heavier than before, like the temperature around us had dropped a few more degrees. We finished the rest of the shift without saying much. Around 4 a.m., when the yard lights switched over for the morning cycle, I passed that same row again. The frost was gone, but there were streaks on the metal, long vertical ones, like something had run wet hands or gloves down the side. That part really got to me because it looked deliberate, 3 long, uneven marks, like fingers dragging condensation. I told our foreman the next day, mostly because the cold spot could have meant some kind of gas leak or chemical issue, and I didn't want to be blamed if something corroded. He sent one of the day guys to check the tank, and they said it was completely fine. No leaks, no residue, no temperature difference. He laughed when I mentioned the black shape. Said maybe I was tired or seeing shadows from a passing plane. But the thing is, there are no flight paths that low over the yard, and even if there were, planes don't block light like that. A couple nights later, I brought my own infrared thermometer gun, the kind you use for checking brake temps. When I passed that car again, the reading dropped to -4 degrees for a few seconds before climbing back up to the mid-20s. I didn't tell anyone that part. What's weird is how subtle it all was. There wasn't any big event, no sound, no flashing lights. Just a quiet section of the yard where light stopped working for a few minutes, and afterward, everything felt off, colder, emptier. I started taking my breaks inside the switch cabin after that. I didn't want to hang around the rows alone anymore. Mark joked about it once, but he didn't go near that end either. One morning, about 2 weeks later, I was clocking out as the sun was coming up. I looked out across the yard, and in the daylight it all looked harmless. Just metal, rust, and frost. But there was something strange about the shadows under the cars. They were too dark compared to the rest of the ground, like the black didn't fade naturally into the gravel. It looked deeper somehow. I thought about walking over, but I didn't. I just watched from the gate as the day crew started arriving. I figured if it was still there, they'd see it too. But they didn't. I still work there, but I switched to earlier shifts. I told them it was for family reasons, but really I just didn't want to be out in that yard after midnight anymore. Every now and then I'll be driving home along I-690, and I'll glance over toward the tracks. Sometimes it looks like the floodlights flicker, just a little. And for a second, I swear there's a patch of black that doesn't move like the rest of the shadows. something sitting still, right where that tank car used to be. I pulled my old aluminum boat into the small cove at the Albany Reservoir around 10 o'clock, just as the last of the city lights were disappearing behind the hills. The night was unusually still for early September, humid but not oppressive. The kind of night where everything feels heavier, almost slow. I had my fishing gear in the back, the cooler with some beers, and a lantern dangling from the bow, just enough light to see my lines and the edges of the boat. I like to come out here late. Fewer people, less noise, and the water's calmer than any pond or creek I've fished. I pushed off and let the current take me a little deeper into the reservoir. The surface was perfectly smooth, only rippling when a fish broke the top. I'd been casting for maybe 20 minutes when I noticed it, a reflection on the water that shouldn't have been there. Not the moon, not my lantern. It was faint, like a soft white shimmer, almost like sunlight on the surface, but the sky was completely overcast. I frowned, trying to convince myself it was just the lantern bouncing oddly off a wave. I adjusted my position, leaned over, and the shimmer didn't move with me. It stayed in the same spot. I tapped my rod against the boat, trying to make a sound to shake off my imagination. The reflection split briefly, like the water itself was bending it, then reformed. I reached for my flashlight and shone it over the water toward the spot. The reflection didn't correspond to anything I could see. No floating logs, no rocks, nothing above the surface. I leaned closer, gripping the edge of the boat, trying to see if it was some kind of optical trick. And then it vanished. Just like that, gone. No ripple, no fade, nothing. I blinked and shook my head. Maybe it was a trick of the clouds, a patch of lighter water reflecting something distant. But then it appeared again, in the same spot, maybe 15 feet ahead of the bow, brighter now, sharper, like someone had painted it on the water. I froze. My heart was thumping, slow but heavy. I tried to tell myself I'd just been staring too long, but my gut told me this wasn't normal. I leaned over the side to get a better look, careful not to tip the boat. The reflection was so clear it looked almost like a glowing coin lying under the surface. I reached a hand toward it, and the moment I did, it disappeared again. My arm trembled as I pulled it back. I sat up and scanned the reservoir, shining the flashlight across the water. No movement, no hint of anything unusual. The forested shoreline was dark, the occasional owl or bat passing silently. Just me, the boat, and the water. I tried to focus on fishing again, but the reflection kept coming back, always in the same spot. And then I noticed something I couldn't explain. Subtle ripples spreading outward from it, concentric rings that didn't match any movement of the boat or breeze. The water was otherwise still, no wind to disturb it. The ripples felt deliberate, almost like they were radiating from a point beneath the surface. I leaned over again, flashlight steady, trying to catch any shape or shadow beneath the shimmer. My eyes strained in the dark, but there was nothing. The water was too murky to see through. I could just make out the faint outline of the reflection hovering above some invisible point. I called out softly, "Hello?" to the empty reservoir, half expecting a reply. Of course, there was none. The night swallowed my voice. I felt more isolated than usual, even out here by myself. I tried to move the boat closer, paddling quietly with the tip of the oar. The moment I reached the spot, the reflection flared for an instant, brighter than before, then vanished entirely. I froze, waiting for it to come back. Nothing. No shimmer, no ripple, just the soft sound of water against the hull. I sat back, rubbing my eyes, trying to ground myself. Maybe it was bioluminescence, or some weird reflection off the clouds I hadn't noticed. But the water wasn't moving, and the light didn't correspond to anything overhead. It felt like something was there, just below, aware of me, watching me. I stayed in the boat for another half hour, casting lines without thinking much about it, but I kept glancing at the spot. Every time I looked away, I felt like the reflection could return, like it had a rhythm of its own. I tried taking pictures with my phone, shaking slightly with the lantern's beam, but the images came out dark. Nothing captured. Eventually, I started heading back to the dock, paddling quietly, trying to calm myself. The reflection never appeared again, and the water returned to normal, perfectly smooth. When I reached shore, I noticed the mud along the bank was still wet, but there were tiny circular depressions in the mud. subtle, shallow, almost like something had hovered over them. I leaned closer, touching them with a finger. Ordinary mud, but the arrangement felt deliberate. I packed the boat quickly, my hands a little shaky. I told myself I'd come back another night, maybe with a buddy, but I haven't. Something about the water that night, the way the reflection hovered, the perfect circles on the mud, made me uneasy. When I tell Elise about it, she listens, nods, doesn't question me, but I can see the doubt in her eyes. I don't blame her. I don't even fully understand what I saw. I've fished this reservoir hundreds of nights, alone, and I've never seen anything like that. Some nights now, when I drive past the reservoir, I glance over, half expecting to see that same shimmer hovering on the water. But there's nothing, just the dark, quiet surface, as if the reflection had never been there at all. Yet I know it was. I can't explain it, and that's what keeps me from going back alone. I don't fish late at night anymore. I stick to the early morning or daylight hours, where I can see the surface clearly, where there's no strange shimmer waiting just out of reach, just above the water, hiding something I don't know. But every so often, when the wind is calm and the reservoir is still, I can feel the memory of it. The reflection, the ripples, the quiet awareness of something beneath the surface, watching. And I think about it when I'm at home, sipping a beer, looking at the dark horizon. I know what I saw was real, but I can't explain it. Not the light, not the ripples, not the sense that something deliberate was there. I can only remember it, and the unease that hasn't left me since that night on the Albany Reservoir. I had planned that weekend in the Taconic Mountains for months. Me and my girlfriend, Elise, wanted a simple camping trip. No cell service, no distractions. We drove up late Friday afternoon, the sky overcast, a little drizzle that turned into light rain as we set up our tent in a clearing about a half-mile off the main trail. The trees were thick, the ground damp, and everything smelled like wet pine. By the time we got the fire going, it was almost dark. We ate some sandwiches, drank warm tea, and just listened to the rain dripping off the tent canopy. I remember Elise pointing out that the mist hanging low between the trees made the whole place feel unreal, almost like we'd walked into one of those old landscape paintings. Around 9, the rain stopped, but the mist stayed. I went out to grab more firewood and noticed a faint glow moving between the tree line. At first, I thought it was another camper's flashlight, but as I squinted, the light wasn't walking or swaying like someone carrying a torch. It hovered, slowly drifting low to the ground. I called Elise over, whispering, "Do you see that?" She nodded, wide-eyed. We watched as it moved through the fog, drifting left, then right, descending toward the denser part of the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to track it, but the beam barely penetrated the mist. When I got closer, the light was gone, just vanished. No trees moved, no sound, nothing. We stayed quiet for a long time. Even the usual night noises, owls, rustling leaves, felt muted, like someone had turned the volume down. I told myself it was a deer's eyes reflecting light or some weird trick of the fog. Elise agreed reluctantly, but she was tense, holding my hand tight. Later, we tried to shake it off and went back to the fire. I poked at the logs while she wrapped herself in a blanket. That's when I noticed the ground around our campsite. There were these flattened patches in the leaves, circular, perfectly round, scattered around the clearing. I shone my flashlight over them. They weren't muddy or disturbed, just pressed down as if something had hovered there briefly. No footprints, no broken twigs, no branches bent, just the leaves flattened. I pointed them out to Elise. She crouched down, running her fingers over the edges. "That's weird," she said. Not like an animal. Too neat." I agreed. My stomach was tightening. I kept thinking about the light from earlier, how it just disappeared, and now these impressions. Nothing fit. We stayed in the tent after that, the fire reduced to embers. Every little sound made me tense. A branch snapping somewhere, a distant rustle. The mist pressed against the tent walls, wet and cold. I thought I saw shadows move out there, shifting shapes that didn't match the trees, but every time I blinked, they were gone. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a soft humming sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. The sound was low, rhythmic, like a distant engine idling, but I couldn't place it. I nudged Elise awake. "Do you hear that?" She whispered yes. We stayed completely still, listening. The hum lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Nothing else. No echo, no movement in the forest, just silence again. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I dozed off, I'd dream of the light. Low, moving, watching, then vanishing. By sunrise, the mist had lifted, but the leaves around the campsite were still pressed down, glistening with dew. We packed quickly, both quiet, neither of us talking about what had happened. On the hike back to the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that hovering light again. I didn't, but the feeling of being observed didn't fully leave me. When we got back to the car, I noticed something else. Small, circular impressions in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Not footprints, nothing recognizable. Just perfect depressions, a few inches across, like someone or something had touched the ground lightly in several places. Elise noticed too, but we didn't linger. I didn't want to look too long, didn't want to hope I'd see anything else. Driving home, the roads were quiet. I kept thinking about the light, the patches of leaves, the hum. I tried to rationalize it all. Deer, swamp gas, reflections from distant cars, but none of it lined up. There was a logic to the impressions, a consistency to the way the light moved that didn't match anything natural I'd seen before. I've been back to the Taconic Mountains a few times since then, but I avoid that area, the clearing we camped in. I can picture it perfectly. The mist, the faint hovering glow, the pressed leaves in neat circles. And even months later, I still feel that subtle unease when I think about it, the sense that whatever we saw, it was aware we were there, just beyond the tree line, silent, watching. I haven't told anyone outside of a few close friends. Most would laugh it off, chalk it up to imagination. But I know what I saw. The leaves, the light, the hum, they didn't match anything ordinary. And even now, I keep glancing over my shoulder when I'm in the woods, half expecting that glow to reappear, drifting silently just above the ground, disappearing before I can get a proper look. It's not like I live in fear. I've been back to the mountains for hiking, for fishing, even for camping, but there's a tension I can't shake when I think of that weekend. It wasn't just a light or a trick of the mist. Something else was there, moving through the trees, and whatever it was, it left its mark. Neat, circular, deliberate, without ever showing itself fully. And that's what I keep coming back to. The part I can't explain, the part I can't make sense of. The leaves, the hum, the light hovering low, then vanishing. I've tried to rationalize it, to find some natural explanation, but nothing fits. And every time I picture it, the unease comes back, subtle but persistent, like the forest itself is still holding a secret just beyond the edge of the trees. It was a warm night in late June, one of those evenings where the air feels thick, but not uncomfortable. I was sitting on the porch after dinner, just letting the house cool off before heading to bed. I live a few miles outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma, on a quiet stretch of land. Not farmland exactly, but enough open space to see the horizon in every direction. My dog, Boone, was lying by my feet, half asleep, twitching every now and then like he was dreaming. The sky was perfectly clear. Not a single cloud, just that deep, endless blue-black you get on summer nights. You could see the Milky Way faintly, which always made me pause a bit. I don't get many nights like that anymore. No wind, no bugs buzzing, just the steady hum of crickets and the occasional bark from somewhere down the road. I was halfway through a beer when I noticed the plane. It was coming from the west, a small blinking light, moving slow and steady, probably cruising at 30,000 feet. I've always liked watching them pass, wondering where they're going, who's on them, that sort of thing. This one looked normal at first, steady white light, faint red on the tail. It took maybe 30 seconds before I realized it wasn't moving anymore. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, that I'd lost perspective or the plane had turned toward me. But after another minute, it was clear it had stopped, just hung there in the sky, perfectly still. No movement, no sound. I leaned forward in my chair and shaded my eyes like that would help. Boone lifted his head and gave a low, uncertain grunt. The light didn't flicker like a star or blink like an aircraft beacon. It just glowed, a dull, steady white. I remember thinking maybe it was a helicopter hovering, but it was too high up, and besides, I would have heard it. The air was dead calm. Even distant highway noise carried that night. There was nothing. I got up and stepped off the porch into the yard. The grass was cool and damp, and I kept my eyes locked on that light. It didn't shift or drift, it stayed fixed in one exact spot. Then, without warning, the stars around it seemed to bend. That's the only way I can describe it. Like the patch of sky around it warped slightly, as if seen through heat haze, except the air was cool. The stars near it wobbled for a second, and then the light was gone. Just gone. I stood there for a long time, scanning the sky. No streak, no fade out. It didn't move away. It simply wasn't there anymore. Boone got up and started pacing, sniffing the air and whining. His tail was down. I went back to the porch and sat down, still looking at the spot where it had been. After a while, I convinced myself it was a trick of the eyes. Maybe the plane turned its lights off or banked hard and disappeared into the darkness. I even laughed a little, trying to brush it off. But about 10 minutes later, I noticed something else. The crickets had stopped. The silence was sudden and total. Even Boone froze mid-step. I could hear the electricity humming through the security light at the side of the house, that faint, high-pitched buzz you only notice when everything else goes quiet. I waited. Nothing. No frogs, no night birds, no distant highway hum. Just that high, thin electrical sound. Then Boone growled, low and deep, not at anything in particular. His ears were up, nose pointed toward the tree line beyond the pasture. I followed his gaze but couldn't see anything. Just the faint outline of cottonwoods against the sky. I called his name softly, but he didn't move. A few seconds later, the security light flickered. Not the usual on-off motion when a moth hits the sensor, but a slow pulse, like it was dimming and brightening in rhythm. Boone backed up until his body pressed against my leg. I remember feeling the vibration of his growl in my calf. The air felt heavy, not humid heavy, but dense somehow, like pressure had dropped all at once. Then everything snapped back. The crickets started up again in a rush, the light steadied. Boone barked once, sharp and loud. I flinched, and when I looked back at the sky, the stars were perfectly normal. No bending, no haze, just the same old sky. I stood there for a while, trying to settle my breathing. After a few minutes, I went back inside. Boone followed immediately, which he doesn't usually do. He likes to stay out late in the summer. Inside, the kitchen clock said 9:47. I remember because I checked my phone too, thinking maybe I'd been out there longer than I thought. My phone said 9:36. 10 minutes difference. I don't know why that unsettled me as much as it did. Maybe because both were digital clocks, no batteries to run down or anything. I reset the kitchen one to match the phone, but that detail stuck in my head all night. I tried to sleep but kept waking up. Around 1 in the morning, I heard Boone growl again from the foot of the bed. I turned on the lamp. He was standing there facing the window, ears forward, every muscle tight. I didn't see anything outside, just darkness and my reflection in the glass, but when I turned the lamp off again, there was a faint glow outside, high above the trees. It wasn't bright enough to light the ground, just a pale white circle hanging in the sky where the plane had been earlier. It looked farther away this time, dimmer, but it was there. I got up and went to the back door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch again. Boone stayed inside. The light didn't move. I watched it for what felt like a long time, maybe 10 minutes. I couldn't tell if it was getting smaller or dimmer or if my eyes were just tired. Then the stars around it warped again, the same way as before, like ripples in water. And then, once more, it disappeared. That was the last time I saw it that night. The next morning, I checked the clock in the kitchen again. It was wrong by exactly 10 minutes, behind the phone this time. I reset it again, and it's been fine ever since. I went out to the yard after breakfast and just stood there, staring at the sky like an idiot. It was bright blue, normal. A few thin clouds moving in from the west. I walked out toward the pasture where Boone had been fixated. Nothing unusual, no tracks, no burned patches, no smell, just grass and dirt. But when I looked down near the porch steps, I noticed something strange. There was a thin layer of white dust on the wood, like fine ash. Not pollen, not sand. It brushed off easily, didn't smell like anything, but it left faint, shiny specks on my fingertips. I wiped it away and didn't think much more about it until later that week when I told my neighbor Curtis about what I'd seen. He laughed at first, said maybe I'd seen a satellite or one of those Starlink things, but when I mentioned the stars bending, he went quiet. Then he said, "You're not the first to say something like that." I asked what he meant, and he told me his wife had called him outside late one night last year because she'd seen a bright star hanging too low above their barn. When he came out, it was gone. He said the weird part was their motion light had been flickering for 10 minutes straight, and their dogs wouldn't go near the back fence for days after. I didn't say much else after that, just nodded and changed the subject. It's been a few months now. Nothing strange has happened since, though every time I sit outside at night, I find myself watching the same part of the sky without meaning to. Sometimes I think I catch a faint shimmer, like the air moving differently for just a second. But maybe it's my eyes playing tricks. Boone doesn't like staying out late anymore. Around 9 or so, he starts pawing at the door, ready to come inside even if it's cool out. He never used to do that. The porch still gets that fine dust sometimes, just a trace of it, even after I sweep. I stop checking the clock at night. I figure if anything wants to mess with my time, it can do it while I'm asleep. I woke up to the smell of damp pine and cold air, the kind that makes you pull your sleeping bag tighter even though you'd zipped it up all the way. My alarm had gone off at 5 a.m., but something made me open my eyes before it. At first, I thought I'd just rolled over in my sleep, but then I noticed the zipper on the tent flap. It wasn't fully closed. Not by much, just a finger-width gap at the top. I never leave it like that. I'm careful about bears and wind. And I was sure I'd zipped it all the way last night. I froze for a second, listening. Nothing. Just the faint rustle of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird starting its morning calls. My backpack, my boots, the food bag, all exactly where I'd left them. Everything inside the tent was untouched. I took a slow breath and unzipped the flap the rest of the way. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought a deer or maybe a raccoon had wandered close, but then I realized what was wrong. The footprints weren't random. They all pointed inward toward the center of my campsite where I'd slept. Some were small, some larger, but all of them led the same direction. They circled the tent, going around it, coming closer in places, and then fading off a few feet away. There were no prints leading outward from the circle, only inward. I stepped out of the tent, boots crunching on the frosted grass. The morning fog clung to the lower slopes of the mountains, softening the light from the rising sun. Everything looked normal, quiet. I scanned the surrounding trees. Nothing. No deer, no hikers, nothing that could have made prints that precise. I walked the perimeter of the tent slowly, my eyes tracing each track. I couldn't find a logical pattern to the spacing. Some prints were close together, others farther apart, but the direction never wavered. Every single one pointed at the tent. My mind started running through possibilities. Someone could have been here in the night, maybe a prankster, but the nearest trail was miles away, and I hadn't seen another camper anywhere nearby. My friends weren't supposed to be arriving until the next day, and if someone had been sneaking around my tent, why leave no footprints leading away? I tried to remember my own movements from the night. I didn't remember getting up at all. No nightmares, no half-waking wanderings, and my flashlight, which I keep under my pillow, was still there. I checked my pack, everything intact. My food bag was still zipped and hung from the tree like I left it. I crouched and examined the prints again. Some of the smaller ones had an almost human-like shape, but too thin, almost elongated. Others were broader, rounder, more like a boot. None matched any of my own shoes or the boots I had in my car. I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. I debated packing up and leaving, but the fog was thick, the trails muddy. I decided to sit back on the log I'd left by the fire pit, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My coffee thermos was empty from last night, and I absent-mindedly opened it, expecting just water. It was still empty, as it should be, but the metal felt strangely cold in my hands. The sun rose higher, burning a little through the fog, and the forest came alive. Birds started chirping, squirrels chattered, and somewhere a stream gurgled. Everything looked normal. Normal enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the footprints, that maybe the frost had created odd impressions in the dirt. Almost. I packed slowly, my mind wandering back to the tracks. The circle, it wasn't perfect, but the way it curved, the spacing, the inward focus, it didn't seem random. like someone or something had been studying me while I slept, moving in a calculated way. I double-checked the tent before taking it down. Nothing else was missing. Everything from last night was exactly as I'd left it. My pack, my boots, even the little notebook I keep in the side pocket. The thought of someone or something walking around me while I slept, watching, without leaving any other trace, it made my stomach tighten. As I started down the trail toward my car, the fog slowly lifting, I kept glancing back over my shoulder. Every time I thought I saw movement, it vanished into the mist. The mountains were quiet, peaceful, but I could feel it in the air. That same tension from the night, the sense of being observed. I drove out of the parking area without seeing anyone on the trail, and by the time I hit the highway, the sun was fully out, burning off the fog. I told myself it was probably nothing, an animal, a trick of the frost and shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those tracks circling my tent, the way they all led inward like a geometric pattern pointing at where I'd slept. Later that week, I told a friend about it over a call. He joked about mountain spirits or my imagination. I laughed along, but the memory of that circle stayed with me. The way the prints seemed deliberate, the way the night had felt heavier near the tent, almost patient. I went back to the same campsite months later with my friends. Everything was normal. No mysterious footprints, no strange air, no sense of being watched. But the memory lingered, especially when I camp alone. I keep my flashlight close, my tent zipped, and I check the ground around me. Sometimes at night, I imagine the footprints forming in the frost, circling the tent again, moving inward silently while I sleep. And though I can't explain it, I feel like something out there, maybe just a trick of nature, maybe something else, knows I'm here before I even wake up. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, one of those short, sharp vibrations that wakes you without the guilt of the full alarm. I blinked up at the ceiling and saw it was 2:11 a.m. The text preview said only, "Go outside. Look west." Maya's name on my screen was enough to make me put my feet on the floor. She's the sort of friend who texts like she's telling you a small, urgent secret. Never the long explanations at 1 in the morning, just the imperative. I grabbed my robe, shoved my feet into slippers, and padded to the back door. Outside, the air hit me hard and cold. It had been a warm day, but the night slipped sharp as knives. The backyard lights were off. I didn't expect anything. Maya lives 2 blocks over, and she doesn't bother watching the sky at ungodly hours. The west was a deep black behind the line of oaks that runs along the edge of our neighborhood. No stars because the tree line ate them. For a second, I thought she was joking. Then I saw it, a single red point of light, steady as a laser, hanging right above the tree line. Not blinking, just there, perfectly round, and the kind of red you don't see from an airplane. Too thin, like an LED you could hold between your fingers. It was maybe the size of a thumbnail at arm's length. My first thought was a drone, except there was no drone sound, no whirring, no breeze. The night felt too still to hold the idea of rotors. I texted back, "Where are you?" while still squinting. Her reply came almost immediately. "At the corner. It's been there 10 min, it's getting closer." I stayed on the porch even though every sensible thing in me said go back inside. The light didn't change for a beat, then seemed to resolve, like when you stop trying to read a smudge on glass and suddenly it becomes a word. I blinked, because blinking is basic human reflex and a way to stall, and when my eyes opened, the light was subtly closer. Closer enough that the space between the tree trunks that framed it made it look like it was sitting in the branches now, instead of above them. I checked the back door handle with the side of my hand, half expecting to find it warm. It was cool. The sound of the neighborhood was wrong in ways I'd notice after. The distant highway that usually thrummed like some steady creature was a thin hiss. The frogs that used to be loud this time of year were silent. A dog barked twice somewhere to the east, and then not again. You don't fully register those absences until something else happens. The porch light flickered. Not the bulb. The whole fixture flicked like someone had blinked a switch, once and again, then steadied. My phone slid down to no bars for a second, then jumped back. I thought of calling the non-emergency line, of calling Maya's number, but the thought of moving away from the light felt like surrendering a vantage point. I wanted to keep looking. It drifted closer in still small steps, not the skitter of a drone, but the confidence of a thing that knows its path. Each time it moved, it seemed to slide between trunks as if finding a hole in the canopy to fit through. At one point, it was low enough I could see a faint halo around it where the leaves caught color and dropped back to green lightless. The red itself didn't spread, it just sat in the center like a bead of lacquer. Maya came up on my porch a minute later, her jog clothes on, hair wrapped in a messy bun, eyes wide and breath visible from the cold. She didn't say hello, she only held up her phone for a second like a talisman and mouthed, "Closer, right?" I nodded. She stepped up to the rail and wrapped her hands around it like someone holding onto a boat. She told me later she'd walked out just to see if I was awake. There's a neighborly absurdity in that. Two adults at 2 in the morning, gauging light across a line of trees like watchmen. We stood there in companionable silence while the thing kept nearing. Nothing else in the yard moved. A moth hit the kitchen window with a soft, wet thud. That was all. I tried the cheap zoom on my phone. The image came up grainy, the red resolved to a small circle with a faint inner dot that suggested depth, like it had a center and a shell. The audio picked up nothing beyond the soft rustle of leaves not being moved. Even the sound absentness felt too measured. I hit record because against better judgment I wanted evidence. Even now, I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to prove to myself that I had not been hallucinating. When you watch something unnatural get closer, your brain does a weird inventory of the familiar. If that's a drone, I can hear the rotors. If it's a lantern someone's walking, I can see their motion. None of that fit. This red light moved with neither animal haste nor mechanical clumsy. It slid with a deliberation that was the opposite of panic, the kind of calm that makes your skin crawl. At one point, the light hovered low enough that I could have thrown a soft toss and hit the branch it hovered over. I blinked, an involuntary reflex blink, and when I opened my eyes, it was closer again. Not dramatically, not an enormous leap. The kind of move you only notice when you blink, like a chess piece slid under your nose when you weren't looking. The hair on my arms pulled up. Maya saw it too. She breathed out a laugh that held no humor, more a noise of disbelief. "It blinked," she said. "When I closed my eyes, it was here." I rationalized, as human beings do, that our perceptions were playing cruel tricks because of the cold and the lack of sleep. We argued in a whisper about whether to wake her husband, whether to call 911, whether one should call 911 for a suspicious light in the trees. We opted for caution and called him anyway. He answered, voice thick and half asleep, and agreed to come look. While we waited, the neighborhood did that single curious thing people do. Neighbors emerged, one in flannel, one with a flashlight, another barefoot in a robe. There were 5 of us now, a small audience on a long, narrow stage of a street. Someone joked about aliens, and the laugh came out too sharp. Everyone's phone camera failed to convey the exactness of the red. On screen, it was more like a smear, a blotchy postage stamp of crimson against black. Ethan, the guy from 2 doors down, climbed onto his truck bed to get a better angle and slipped a quarter turn on the top of his boot. He swore under his breath. When he steadied himself, the light had shifted again, closer to the line of houses. That's when the sense in the group changed. What had been curiosity rippled into something like awareness. We had moved from watchers to noticed. Maya's husband pulled into the street in his robe with a flashlight and a baseball cap. He got out and stood with his hands in his pockets. He didn't have a long speech. Nobody did. We stood together and watched one small red dot move from branch to branch like someone walking a wire. A car rolled slowly past down the road and the driver slowed, craned his neck, then went on, eyes wide. The light didn't flinch. Then the dogs started. A chorus from a dozen yards down started a staccato set of yelps and then silence. The red light dipped and went behind the dense part of the trees, and for a moment we saw nothing. I blinked. Mechanical now, a reflex I couldn't shake, and when my eyes cleared it was farther down the row, almost at the house line, the red getting brighter and more resolved, like some small reality had accreted into being as it descended. Past that point, logic and self-preservation are thin. We were out there in our slippers watching a small punctuation mark move through the trees. I thought of film tropes and the stupid, predictable ways those stories ended, I thought about how I wanted to go inside and lock the door. I thought, panic will make you sprint. Instead, I took a step closer on the railing because I wanted to see how the red looked when it was almost at porch level. It paused above my neighbor's roof, maybe 12 feet off the ground. There wasn't a source, no person, no wire. The red glowed like a coin, and then, quietly, as if someone had decided the scene was enough, it blinked out in a single, clean instant. Not a fade, just gone. The street seemed to exhale all at once. Dogs started again, a relief bark that sounded human. The night filled with ordinary sounds like a film reel snapping back into place. We all stood there under the porch light that came back on, electrical systems resetting with a clack somewhere down the line, and said the small things people say to fill an absence of explanation. Did you see that? Did it move? Who sent that text? Maya's husband shook his head and laughed like he was checking to see if humor would hold. Someone suggested it might have been a hunting laser, or a prank, or a weird break in the atmosphere. We tried words on like clothes that didn't quite fit. I went back inside because there's only so long you can stand in front of your own front door and pretend everything is normal. I locked it, checked the deadbolt twice, and made a pot of tea in a hands-on ritual that eased something tight in my chest. My phone got a single ping. Maya. It left. Sorry for the text. Her husband later said he watched the security footage from their Ring camera, and there was nothing but trees swaying and a single frame where the image over the lawn was pinprick red, and then, on the very next frame, black. The timestamps on their camera were off by 1 minute compared to mine. I slept in the chair that night with the TV low and the teacup gone cold on the side table. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the red dot. How small it was, how close, and the fact that it had come without a sound. In the morning, the world looked exactly the way it had the day before. Mail on the porch, the trash cans waiting, the sky like it wanted to be unremarkable. Someone from the neighborhood group posted a shaky clip taken from across the street. The red was a smear on their phone, then nothing. Maybe it was a drone, a prank, a trick of tired eyes and cold air. Maybe there was a perfect explanation that requires data I don't have. I don't have an answer. I have the memory of a text in the middle of the night, the sight of a red light that moved when I blinked, and the clean, ordinary rituals I used afterward. Locking the door, making tea, checking that the world behaved normally again. That was the balm I accepted. Normal things resumed, and I went to work the next day with the same keys in my pocket, the same dog walker at the corner, the same neighbor who borrowed sugar at noon and said, "Did you see anything last night?" I nodded and told him the small version of the story. He laughed, shrugged, and went back to his lawn. The only odd trace I kept was the little gray smudge on my sleeve where I'd wiped the porch rail after the light had passed. No explanation for it, nothing that matched a plausible source. I kept the shirt hanging by the back door for days, a quiet reminder that some nights are ordinary until the moment they aren't. It was late autumn when it happened. Cold enough that the radiators in my flat clicked and hissed most nights, but not yet winter. I'd been on the local radio a few days earlier, one of those casual call-in segments they run when the news is slow. I only phoned because the host Graham was talking about odd things people had seen in the sky. I figured, why not? 2 weeks before that call, I'd seen something strange walking home from the pub. I cut across the park near the canal, and when I looked up, there was this line of lights hanging low and moving slowly. Not a plane. I know what planes look like, and this was too quiet, too close, and the lights weren't in any configuration I recognized. It was like 6 or 7 spheres glowing white, shifting around as if they were connected by something invisible. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before they tilted and slid off behind the clouds. No sound, no trail, just gone. That was basically what I told Graham on the radio, a short, clumsy description of lights in the sky. Nothing dramatic. He joked about me needing another pint, the usual. I hung up, and that was the end of it, or so I thought. 3 nights later, I heard a knock at my door. It was around 10:30. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I don't usually get visitors that late. At first, I thought maybe it was the downstairs neighbor again complaining about noise, but when I opened the door, there was a man standing there I'd never seen before. He was tall, easily 6'2", and dressed in a black suit with a white shirt buttoned all the way up. No tie, though. His skin was pale, his face narrow, hair dark and combed flat against his head. He looked older than me, maybe early 40s, but it was hard to pin down. What stood out most were his eyes. Not the color, they were a dark brown, but the way he held them on me. Unblinking, fixed, like he wasn't entirely sure how eye contact worked, but was forcing it. "Mr. Harker?" he asked. That's my name, so I nodded. He didn't offer a hand or introduce himself. He just stood there in the doorway until I stepped aside out of politeness. He walked in slowly, like he was measuring each step. I asked what this was about, but he didn't answer right away. He stopped in the middle of the living room, glanced at the books on my shelf, the half-empty glass of water on the table, and the pile of unopened mail. Then he turned to me and said, very calmly, "You described lights in the sky. I would like to know about the patterns of sound you noticed." The way he said it, it wasn't a question. More like he was reminding me of something. But I hadn't mentioned sound. Not on the radio, not to anyone. The whole point was how quiet the thing had been. I told him that. I said there wasn't any sound. That's what made it so odd. He tilted his head like he didn't quite believe me. No hum, no resonance, not even a vibration. His words were slow, deliberate, like he'd rehearsed them. Again, I told him no, just lights. That was it. He stared at me for what felt like too long, then sat down in my armchair without asking. His movements were stiff, like he was imitating how people sit but hadn't practiced much. He folded his hands on his knees and asked me to describe the exact arrangement of the lights. I did my best, but he kept interrupting to ask if they pulsed in sequence, if they overlapped, if the brightness shifted in cycles. Those were his words, pulses and cycles. I started to feel uneasy. He wasn't threatening exactly, but something about the way he focused on these details, especially the ones I hadn't even thought about, made me nervous. He wasn't writing anything down either. No notebook, no phone, nothing. Just sitting there, staring and asking questions. At one point he asked if I'd had any unusual dreams since the sighting. That threw me. I said no, not really, but the truth is I'd been waking up in the middle of the night for no reason, just sitting upright in bed, heart racing, no memory of what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't tell him that. After maybe 20 minutes, he stood up abruptly. No goodbye, no thank you. He just said, "If you notice the sounds, you will know what they mean." Then he walked to the door, opened it himself, and stepped into the hallway. I followed him out, more to make sure he was leaving than anything. He went down the stairs slowly, again in that careful, almost mechanical way. I leaned over the railing, and by the time he reached the bottom, I expected to hear the front door open. But there was nothing. No creak of the hinges, no slam, just silence. I waited a full minute, then went down after him. The entryway was empty. The street outside was quiet, just one car parked under the lamp. No sign of him walking away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, especially that line, the patterns of sound. It was like he knew something I didn't. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if maybe there had been a sound that night in the park, something too faint for me to register. Or maybe he was planting the idea in my head on purpose. The strangest part came a week later. I was brushing my teeth with the bathroom window cracked open when I heard this low, steady hum. At first, I thought it was the boiler or maybe traffic from the main road, but it wasn't. It was deeper, more even, almost like standing next to an electric transformer, except it was coming from outside, not inside. I turned off the tap and just stood there, listening. The hum went on for maybe a minute, then faded out completely. I ran to the window and looked down at the street. Nothing unusual. Just the same cars, the same empty pavement. I never saw the man again. We'd gone up to Loch 80 for a weekend camping trip. My girlfriend at the time, Laura, had just bought new gear and wanted to test it out before autumn set in. It was late August, warm during the day, but cold enough at night that you wanted a decent sleeping bag. We found a spot off a forestry track on the north side, a flat bit of ground just up from the water with a clear view across the loch. No other campers in sight, only a farmhouse in the distance with its lights faint against the trees. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you hear every ripple on the water and every branch shifting overhead. That night after dinner, we sat by the water's edge. just listening. Around 11, when it was fully dark, Laura noticed something first. "Look," she said, pointing out across the loch. At first I thought it was just a reflection of a star, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. A sphere of light, pale yellow, about the size of a lantern, hovering maybe 100 feet above the surface. Another appeared beside it, then a third, and they kept perfect distance from each other. They didn't blink like plane lights. They didn't cast beams like a torch or boat lamp. They just glowed, steady, with this strange, pulsing quality that made the water shimmer below them. We didn't speak much, just sat there frozen, watching. They drifted from one side of the loch to the other without making a sound. Once they lowered closer to the surface and the reflection doubled itself. 3 spheres above, 3 on the water, moving together. After maybe 15 minutes, they rose higher, faded, and were gone. No trail, no noise, just darkness again. We went back to the tent without saying much. I remember lying there, listening harder than I ever had in my life, half convinced I'd hear something approach through the trees. But all I caught was the occasional splash of a fish or the wind brushing through the heather. In the morning, I was unzipping the tent flap when I realized 2 men were standing about 10 feet away. Both wore dark suits, black ties, white shirts. Their clothes looked wrong for where we were, creased but dry, like they hadn't hiked through mud or brush to get there. They didn't smile or introduce themselves. One of them, taller, with very short dark hair, asked, "Did you hear the hum?" It froze me. I hadn't told anyone what we'd seen, not even Laura's brother, who knew where we'd camped. And we hadn't said a word to each other about sound, because there hadn't been any. Laura sat up behind me, rubbing her eyes, and asked what he meant. The second man, lighter hair, no expression, repeated the same thing. "The hum. Did you hear it?" We said no, that we hadn't heard anything. They both looked at each other, just a flicker of a glance, like they were confirming something silently. Then the tall one said, "Thank you." And without another word, they turned and walked back up the forestry track. We sat there stunned. I didn't even think to grab my boots and follow until they were out of sight. When I finally went up the track, it was empty. No car sounds, no footprints in the soft mud, nothing. Later that day, when we packed up, Laura pointed out that the sheep in the field by the farmhouse were all crowded on one side, pressed tight against the fence, like they were trying to get as far from the loch as possible. Driving home, we tried to talk about it, but it felt strange, like saying too much out loud might make it worse. The only detail that stuck in my head over and over was how certain they'd been that we'd heard something, that hum. We never camped at Ative again. I was driving back from a friend's place in Alamo, Nevada, heading toward my apartment in Henderson. It was past 1 in the morning, and the road was almost empty. That stretch of Highway 93 always felt lonely at night, like you're moving through a big hollow tunnel of desert. I had the radio low, mostly for background noise, and was keeping an eye on the fuel gauge since I hadn't filled up before leaving. About half an hour south of Alamo, I noticed something odd in my rearview mirror. 3 small white lights, faint but steady, arranged in a perfect triangle. They were far back, but clearly not car headlights, too high off the ground and too evenly spaced. At first I thought it was a plane, or maybe 3 planes lining up, but the formation never shifted. I watched for a few seconds, then shook it off and kept my eyes on the road. A few miles later, I glanced back again. Same 3 lights, same formation, same distance. I slowed down a little to let the car behind me, if there was one, catch up, but nothing appeared on the road. I flipped my high beams off and on, just to see if any reflection showed up. Nothing changed. The lights were still up there, small dots in the mirror. I figured maybe it was my dirty mirror or my eyes playing tricks. I wiped the inside of the windshield at the next stop sign with an old shirt I had in the passenger seat. When I looked again, the triangle was still there. The lights never blinked or moved. Past Ash Springs, the road widens and you can see for miles. I checked my side mirrors, clear. I looked straight up through the windshield, nothing but stars. I tilted my head to see more of the sky, but saw nothing unusual. Yet, in the rear view, those 3 dots stayed fixed. I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't dramatic fear, more like the slow creep you get when something doesn't add up. I kept driving and tried not to look, but curiosity made me check again every couple of minutes. Each time, the same triangle. I pulled over at a gravel turnout just before a small bridge. Killed the engine. The night was dead quiet except for a faint hum of wind. I got out of the car and looked back up the road and into the sky. No lights, just the normal scatter of stars, a few faint clouds on the horizon, and the dark outline of low hills. I stayed there for maybe 2 minutes, scanning the sky. I even walked a little away from the car to get a better angle. Nothing. I climbed back in, shut the door, and checked the mirror. The lights were gone. I started the car again and got back on the highway. After a few miles, I risked another glance. There they were again. Same formation, same distance. They didn't seem closer or farther, just hanging back like they were tied to me somehow. I tried turning off my headlights for a second. Everything went dark except my dashboard and those 3 dots in the mirror. I turned them back on quick. I even flashed my brights at nothing, like maybe it would trigger something. Nothing happened. At one point, I slowed almost to a stop in the middle of the road. There was no traffic anywhere, hoping the lights would pass or move or change. But when I came to a crawl and glanced again, they were still there, perfectly still. Around Crystal Springs, I pulled into a dirt access road used by ranchers, drove about 100 yards in and parked. I cut the engine again. This time I left the car dark and sat there, gripping the wheel, breathing slow. The desert was silent. I tilted the rearview mirror down so it pointed at my lap. Waited. After a minute, I nudged it back up. The triangle of lights was there. My stomach turned. I got out again, a little shaky. The air was cool and smelled dusty. I looked behind me. Nothing but empty desert. Looked straight up, just stars. My eyes kept flicking between where the lights should have been and the empty sky. It felt like they only existed in that mirror. I climbed back in, adjusted the mirror one more time, and watched for a solid 30 seconds without blinking. The dots held steady, no flicker. I reached back for my phone, thinking to take a photo, but the moment I raised it, the screen reflected the mirror, and I couldn't get it to focus. It just showed black. Finally, I just drove. I figured if it was some weird optical thing, it would fade. But mile after mile, the triangle stayed. I passed a rest area near Indian Springs and debated stopping, but the idea of stepping out under the empty sky again made me feel sick. Somewhere past Cactus Springs, I noticed something different. One of the 3 lights had dimmed, like a dying bulb. A minute later, it blinked out completely. Then the second went. Only 1 light remained, dead center in the mirror. I focused on the road and refused to look again for a while. When I finally did, the mirror showed only my back window and the dark highway stretching behind me. No lights. I didn't stop until I hit the outskirts of Henderson, pulled into a gas station, turned off the car, and just sat there. The sky above was blank, city lit, nothing strange. I checked the mirror a few more times while fueling up. Empty. No triangle, no single light. Just the normal reflection of pumps and asphalt. I drove the rest of the way home without seeing anything else unusual. When I parked in my spot and shut off the engine, the silence felt heavy but normal again. I stayed there a few minutes before going inside, like I needed to make sure everything around me was still ordinary. Even now, I can't make sense of it. I wasn't tired enough to be hallucinating, and I know what normal aircraft look like out here, but those lights, whatever they were, only existed in that mirror, following me for nearly an hour down an empty desert highway. I was driving back from my sister's place in Beatty, Nevada, late one Sunday night. It was one of those desert roads where you can go 30 minutes without seeing another car. The sky was perfectly clear, the kind of black where the stars look like holes punched through paper. I'd done the drive dozens of times before. Down 95, then cutting across a smaller county road toward Alamo, but this time I'd left later than usual. By the time I got onto that smaller road, it was a little after midnight. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station out of Vegas, and the heater barely running. My car's an old '06 Civic, not much insulation, so at night in the desert, it feels like you're driving a tin can. The headlights were catching the road signs in that washed-out green way, nothing unusual. Then something ahead of me caught my eye. At first I thought it was a plane's landing light, but it was too low and too steady. A faint glow. white with a hint of blue, moving across the sky from left to right. It looked small at first, like a star, but as I drove, it stayed with me, matching my pace without blinking. I slowed down to about 50, leaning forward over the wheel. The radio made a faint pop, like when you plug in an aux cord, and went silent. No static, just dead quiet. The heater fan kept running, but the music was gone. I reached over to adjust the dial, thinking maybe the signal dropped. Nothing. That's when the glow moved directly above me. Not fast, slow, like a balloon, but steady. It was a perfect orb, maybe the size of a car if it were closer, but I couldn't tell how high it was. It didn't throw light like a spotlight. It just glowed. No sound, no wind. I kept driving, gripping the wheel. My heart was going, but I wasn't panicking yet. I thought maybe it was some kind of drone, but it was too smooth and there were no blinking nav lights. The orb drifted ahead of me, then slowed until it was directly over my hood, perfectly centered. Then the radio came back on, but wrong. Same station, same song, but everything was reversed. It took a second for my brain to register it. The vocals were backwards, the guitar riffs reversed. It sounded like the song was being sucked into itself. I turned the radio off completely. The silence inside the car felt heavy, like the air was thicker. The orb stayed with me for maybe another 30 seconds. My speed dropped to 40, then 30. There were no pullouts, just dirt shoulders and sagebrush. I finally eased onto the shoulder and stopped. The headlights lit up a patch of gravel and weeds. I cut the engine, but left the lights on. The orb stopped too, hanging silently above the road about 20 feet ahead. I opened the door and stepped out. The air was cold and dry. No hum, no vibration. Just that thing hanging there, glowing soft and steady. It wasn't casting shadows. The stars behind it seemed dimmer, like it was sucking up the light. I took a step toward it. It didn't move. My phone was in my pocket, so I pulled it out to take a picture, but the screen stayed black when I opened the camera. The battery indicator was at 70%, but the phone wouldn't respond. No shutter sound, no focus. I looked back at my car. The taillights were dimmer than normal. The dashboard clock wasn't lit. Everything felt muted, like when snow muffles sound, except it was bare desert. The orb started moving again, slow, drifting to the right side of the road. Then, without speeding up, it lifted, just a clean, smooth ascent. No trail, no flicker. Up and up until it was gone, blending with the stars. The second it disappeared, the car's dash lights came back on. The heater fan kicked up, the radio snapped on, playing the song normally again, right where it should have been. My phone's camera opened like nothing had happened. I got back in the car and sat there with my hands on the wheel. The dashboard clock read 12:48 a.m. My watch on my wrist said 12:27. I couldn't remember if I'd checked them earlier. I started driving again, faster this time. The radio played fine, no weirdness. My phone worked, but the headlights seemed dimmer for another couple miles before brightening back to normal. When I hit the highway junction about 40 minutes later, I stopped at the gas station there. The attendant, a guy in his 20s, asked if I'd seen that light, too. I asked what he meant. He said something bright had passed over the station about an hour earlier. No sound, just light. The power had flickered inside, but not gone out. I didn't know what to say. I paid for gas and drove the rest of the way home without stopping again. Everything was normal by then. The clocks matched. The car felt fine. The next day, I checked my phone's GPS log from the drive. There was a blank stretch of about 2 minutes right where I'd pulled over, like it hadn't recorded anything. No photo in the gallery either, just a black square where I'd tried to take one. I haven't driven that road at night since. I was out before dawn because that's how you do it when the weather says it might be worth a day. The forecast had been vague, gray with a chance of clearing, but the sea looked flat from the shore, a sheet of dull pewter that promised the small shoals would be visible once the light came. I'd been fishing these waters my whole life, and the bit of coast north of St. Andrews was one of those places you thought you knew. That morning, it felt like I was the only person who'd been left awake. I puttered the little Boston whaler past the rocks at the edge of the bay, keeping low to avoid the bird scatters near the kelp beds. The tide was out enough that my usual markers, the big, jagged boulder, the rusted post, were all half exposed, the waterline kissing their undersides. It was the sort of morning where small things stood out: the pattern of wind on water, a shoal of sprats rising, the way the gulls squawked and settled in different numbers. When I say small things, I mean the things that tell you whether a day will be good or not. Around 7, when the light was a flat gray, I noticed the birds. Not just fewer, but wrong. There were pockets where the surface should have been full of motion, and there was nothing. No dabble of white, no flare. The gulls were on the cliffs, not on the water. A tern passed low and then banked away as if something had startled it. I didn't feel like moving closer yet. I sat with the engine idling and had another look through the binoculars. The first odd thing I saw was on the horizon, just off the line where sea met sky. From that distance, it could have been anything: a fishing boat tied up at anchor, a marker buoy, but the shape was too smooth and too bright. It was silver in tone, like the inside of a foil packet. It hovered, not bobbing with the swell, but steady, as if someone had nailed it to the sky. The light didn't hit it like a reflection, it seemed to glow from its own surface. I eased closer, not because I was brave, but because that's what you do. Closer gives answers. The closer I got, the more other little things added up wrong. The air felt cleaner, like someone had turned a window in the engine room. My radio kept filling with static even though there wasn't a storm in sight. The static wasn't loud, it was a thin hiss that rose and fell with the boat's speed, like something tuned to frequency that shouldn't be there. When I turned the radio off, the hiss stopped. Then a second later, a faint, low sound threaded under everything, more felt than heard, like a distant harbor engine idling and not quite in time. I had the binoculars up when I realized the object's reflection was missing. That's the word for it. Missing. The water around it showed the usual ripple and glimmer, but where you'd expect the silver shape's twin on the surface, there was nothing. I watched the waves slap at that place, and the surface broke as if it knew there was nothing to reflect. It made no sense. Even buoyant stuff makes a shadow and a double in the sea. The ripples would catch it, but the water acted like the light never reached it. I slowed until the motor was just a soft purr. I could see the object now as a loose, silent oval, maybe the size of a small trawler, but without any hull or mast, just a shape suspended a few meters above the waves. No wake, no heat shimmer, no birds circling it. It was motionless like a buoy, but suspended above the surface in flat air that smelled of salt and nothing else. The binoculars made it fringe and close. I could see lines on its skin, but no bolts or seams, a continuous sheen, dull, like tarnished chrome. I thought about turning back then. I don't like things without names, and this was a thing without a name. I thought of home, the kettle on the stove, Maggie asleep with the radio. Then I thought, sod it. I'm a curious man. I brought the boat in nearer until the bow pointed toward it, and I left the engine in neutral so I'd drift. That's when the tide did something I'd never seen. The water that had been sitting low around the rocks started to move inward in a way that didn't match the swell. It wasn't a wave so much as a pulling, a broad shoulder of water that came in fast, faster than the charts said it should. The kelp beds that had been waving lazily were suddenly knitting together, then stretching as if someone had gathered the sea by the hem and dragged it. The rocks I'd measured for years went under so quick the whole boat shuddered and brushed against a patch I'd always kept clear. It was fast enough to make me curse and throw the engine into gear to keep a little movement, but I didn't want to rope the boat around anything. My hands were slick, my heart was up around my throat. The surge wasn't the usual trick of the channel or a gust. It felt deliberate. And while the sea moved inward, the silver thing stayed where it had been, calm, detached, like a ceiling lamp over a kitchen sink. I'd been in storms that made fine men pray, and I know how water remembers the moon, but this had none of that rule set. The tide rose along the whole little bay, neat as if someone had flipped a basin. The gulls took to the wind in a long, trying flight, their calls sharp and staccato. The radio crackled back to life when I'd flicked it on for a second. No voice, just the thin hiss again, and the low sound under the engine hummed in my teeth. I put the binoculars up once more. The silver thing was the same, but the lack of reflection sat in my head like a missing brick. I scanned the surface around it, expecting to see some distortion, a slick of oil, but nothing. The water looked right apart from the lack of twin. When I lowered the binoculars, I felt the air shift like a draught in a closed room. The sound under the engine vanished at that same moment, and the whir of my motor seemed brash and intrusive. Then, in the next breath, the silver shape dimmed, not like switching off, but shading down, as if someone had folded a curtain over it. The field of light around it softened into the normal gray of the sea and sky. You know when the sun goes behind thin cloud and everything turns polite? It was like that. And the second it softened, the tide stilled, as if someone had set a hand on the water's back and told it to stay. The quiet that descended wasn't the calm of a day ending, it was hollow. The low hum never came back. The only noise was the slap of little waves against the hull. And even that sounded wrong, too crisp. I didn't see it vanish. One blink and the object wasn't there anymore. There was no skid of motion, no upward streak. One blink, and my binocular field showed only the regular dull horizon and a band of white where waves broke further out. I found myself laughing once, a short, sharp laugh that came out of me without control. It felt like the sort of laugh you make when you've let fear uncork and don't know what to do with it. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe a reflection from something farther off, a hallucination from a long night and little sleep. Maybe the radio static and the tide were unrelated. Maybe. I didn't stay to prove any of those maybes. I tightened the engine and kept a hand on the wheel until the little bay was behind me. The houses along the seafront were empty and dark when I came in, the net drying racks stacked like ribs. Maggie was on the table with a pot of tea boiling over and a bowl for my boots. She looked up and said my name like she'd expected me to come in messy. She always did, the way wives know the shape of their men. I tried to speak normal, but my words kept catching. At home, I scrubbed salt off my face and the back of my neck, put the kettle on, and tried to make sense of the morning in my head between sips. I told her about the birds, about the sound, about the shape. She listened and asked the sensible questions. Did I see any markings, any heat, any craft? I answered as best I could. She asked if I'd gone too close. I said I'd kept a distance. I said I'd never seen a tide move like that in my life. By noon, the light had changed. The sea looked like a different thing. Blue and willing, people out on the promenade with dogs. Someone was walking the line where the water had rushed in, picking up shells and laughing because the morning had been chilly but clear. The bay looked ordinary in that way that worries me most. The world goes on, steady, with or without an answer. I told the harbor master when he came by that afternoon because that's what you do. You tell a man who keeps a book. He nodded and scratched at his beard, asked me to note the time. He said he'd heard nothing on the VHF. He said he'd had calls about a strange fog bank 2 miles out the week before, which had been gone by noon. He said a lot of things like men who are used to things that aren't right do, understandable, plausible, and then nothing that closed the circle. That night I slept badly and woke at odd hours, listening for a hum I never heard again. For a week, I found myself looking at the bay from the window when it should have been my mind on other things. I kept the binoculars on their hook by the door for longer than I should have. Sometimes the gulls would hang in a way that made my skin prickle, but the sea stayed steady. I don't have a tidy end to this tale. The silver thing didn't come back. The tide never surged that way again. I still can't explain why the surface where it hung didn't reflect it, why the water moved like hands had grabbed it, why the radio hissed at the moment I drew near and stopped the moment it dimmed. I can tell you only what I saw and how the morning pressed at me after. The rest sits there, a blank, easy to look past when the kettle's on and Maggie's humming in the kitchen, but as neat and stubborn as a bruise when the light hits just right and the sea looks like pewter again. I was up before the sun, like I always am. Name's Ewan McLeod, and I've been farming a small patch outside Aberdeen for most of my life. Early mornings aren't unusual for me, but that one was different. It was just starting to get light, pale blue streaks cutting through low clouds, and the mist was still heavy over the barley fields. The air had that damp iron smell you get near the river in spring. I just finished filling the water troughs when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, a reflection off some old tin in the barn maybe. But no, it wasn't on the ground. There it was, hovering maybe 50 feet above the field near the north fence. A perfect disc, metallic, reflecting the dim light in a dull gray-white shimmer. It didn't move like a plane or a drone. It just hung there, silent and somehow solid. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. I've seen plenty of strange things in the sky. Geese in weird formations, the odd weather balloon. But this was different. It didn't drift or sway. It just stayed in one spot, not affected by the morning wind. I grabbed my binoculars, thinking maybe it was some experimental aircraft, but there was nothing else around it. No wings, no markings, no tail, no noise. I reached for my phone to call my neighbor, old Colin, because I figured, well, I'd seen enough weird things in my life to know that people aren't supposed to see something like this alone. While I was dialing, I turned back to the field, and it was gone. The disc had just disappeared. Panic didn't hit me immediately, just this heavy, almost physical confusion. I walked toward the field, thinking maybe it had landed or that just misjudged it. The barley looked normal, swaying with the breeze, until I stepped closer. There was a circle where the grass was flattened, pressed down in a near-perfect disc. It wasn't torn or broken, just pressed. Smooth, like someone had laid down and rolled out over it. I crouched, running my fingers over the stalks. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest it was anything terrestrial. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was frost settling oddly, but the circle was too clean, too precise. I called Colin again, voice shaking a little. He answered on the second ring. "Colin, you awake? Ewan? It's early. What's up? You've got to come see this field. Now, north end by the fence." There was a pause, then a grumble. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't touch anything." I hung up and waited, pacing along the edge of the field. Every so often I'd glance up, half expecting the disc to return, but the sky was empty, just fog and streaks of early light. Colin arrived, slow, his old pickup crunching over the frost-hardened ground. He climbed down, scratched his head, and followed me to the circle. He looked at it, blinked, and muttered, "Well, I'll be." "Seen anything like this before?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not outside stories my granddad told, crop circles, bits of metal in the sky, but nothing real." We stood there for a few minutes, silent, just watching the morning light make the dew on the flattened barley sparkle. I kept glancing toward the horizon, half expecting the disc to reappear. Nothing. "What's odd," Colin said finally, "is that the frost on the edges is untouched. Only the circles smooth like someone pressed it deliberately. No other marks." I nodded. My mind kept flipping through possibilities. Helicopters, small aircraft, some farmer messing about. But the silence, the perfect shape, the way it just vanished before I could get a proper look, none of it added up. By the time we'd measured it roughly, taken a few photos with my phone, and compared notes, the sun had risen fully. The mist was lifting, revealing the rest of the field and the low hills beyond. The disc was nowhere. No sound. No trace in the sky. We tried rationalizing it as much as we could while walking back to the farmhouse. Maybe it was an experimental drone from the university, some kind of weather monitoring thing. But drones don't hover so large, so solid, with no noise. And the flattened circle, nothing man-made would do that so cleanly without leaving evidence. I kept looking at the photos on my phone. The circle was visible, slightly brighter where the sun hit the frost differently. Nothing else. I showed them to Colin, who just shook his head. "I can't explain that, Ewan. Don't think anyone else will either." For the next few days, I couldn't stop checking the field. The circle stayed exactly as it was, the barley slowly rising back up, but still showing the imprint if you look close. No more lights in the sky, no more hovering discs. It was as if it had been a momentary anomaly, gone as quickly as it appeared. I mentioned it to a few other farmers in the area over the week. Most laughed it off. One old bloke swore he'd seen similar in the 60s near Aberdeen. None could offer any explanation. I keep the photos on my phone. Sometimes I look at them and wonder if I imagine the disc itself, even though the flattened circle is real, undeniable. I've gone back to that part of the field many times. Nothing else happens. But every time I do, I feel that same quiet, that pause in the morning where the air feels like it's holding its breath. It wasn't terrifying, not in the traditional sense. Just wrong. Out of place. The kind of wrong that leaves your mind running through explanations and coming up empty. I farmed this land for decades, and I've seen all sorts of things. Fog that rolls in like it's alive, strange cloud formations, flocks behaving oddly, but nothing like that morning. I can't explain it. I don't know if anyone can. And yet, I'll keep an eye on that sky and that field every morning I can, because if it ever comes back, I want to see it with my own eyes again. I first heard the hum late one night in February. The Isle of Mull is quiet in winter, especially where my cottage sits above the cliffs near Carseg. I'd been living there for a few years, working part-time at the ferry terminal and doing odd carpentry jobs. That night, I'd just finished sanding a door and stepped outside to shake the dust off my jumper. The air was cold, the kind that makes your breath hang for a moment before drifting off. I noticed the hum right away. It was low, steady, like the engine of a distant ship, but the sea below was calm and empty. At first, I thought it was the wind making a trick through the rocks. Mull can be strange that way, sounds bouncing around the cliffs, but there was no wind, just stillness and that hum soft enough you could almost ignore it. But once you caught it, you couldn't stop listening. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It felt like it was everywhere at once, seeping through the ground. The next morning at the cafe in Craignor, I asked Ewan, who runs the place, if he'd noticed it. He looked at me for a second and said, "That noise by Carseg?" Like it wasn't news to him. He told me a few people had mentioned it, fishermen mostly, and a woman who rents the holiday cottage near mine. But he didn't make a big deal of it. "Weird acoustics along the cliffs," he said. "Nothing new." I let it go for a week. The hum wasn't there every night, but when it came back, it would stick around for hours, usually after dark. Sometimes it would rise a little, like a pitch shift, then dip back down. It wasn't loud, but it made my windows vibrate slightly. More than once, I woke up in the small hours thinking my phone was buzzing on the nightstand, only to realize it was that low sound again. One night in early March, my neighbor Fiona stopped by. She's older, lives farther inland, but walks her dog along the cliffs most evenings. She asked me if I'd been hearing it too. I told her I had, and she said she'd tried to follow it, but it didn't get louder or quieter no matter where she stood. "It's like it's under the earth," she said, rubbing her arms, "or under the water." We both went outside then, around 9. The sky was clear and the moon bright enough to see the path down to the edge. The hum was there again, steady, deeper than before. Fiona's dog whined and wouldn't go near the cliff. I shone my torch around, but saw nothing unusual, just the jagged rocks, the heather bending slightly in the breeze, and the black stretch of water below. A few days later, I decided to check the area in daylight. There's a rough path that runs down near the rock formations called the Carseg Arches. I took my camera, thinking maybe I'd catch something, but the day was normal. Gulls, a few seals on the rocks, and no hum at all. The strangeness really started 2 weeks after that. It was a calm evening, the tide low and the hum louder than I'd ever heard it. Not enough to hurt, but enough to feel in my ribs. I stepped outside in a faint glow along the cliff edge about 200 meters away. It wasn't like a torch or a car headlight. It was a smooth, pale strip of light, almost level with the top of the rock, and it didn't flicker. I walked toward it slowly. My boots crunched on the gravel, and as I got closer, the glow seemed to draw back like it was sliding away. But when I stopped, it stopped too. The hum was stronger there. I crouched down and ran my hand over the ground, expecting to feel vibration, but it was cold and still. Then, without any noise or movement, the glow went out, just black rock again. The hum faded a few seconds later, like someone turning down a volume knob. I went back to the cottage, a bit shaken. I didn't tell anyone that time. But the next day at the ferry terminal, a man named Callum, who runs one of the tour boats, asked me if I'd been out late the night before. I said yes, and he told me he'd been bringing his boat in around 10 when he saw a dark shape resting on the cliff near Carseg. He couldn't make it out clearly, but said it looked like a black craft sitting on the rocks. He thought it was a wreck, or maybe some kind of Navy thing, until it rose straight up, slow and silent, and disappeared into the clouds. He laughed after he said it, like he knew how it sounded. But he wasn't joking. "Never seen anything like it," he said. "No lights, no noise, just gone." That night, the hum came back, even stronger. I sat inside with the lights off, looking out the window toward the cliff. Around midnight, I saw a flash, just a quick pulse of white. Not lightning, not a car. Then silence. The hum stopped completely after that. For several nights, there was nothing. No hum, no lights. Then Fiona knocked on my door one morning. She said she'd been walking at dawn and thought she saw small marks on the rock near where we'd been standing that night. A series of smooth depressions in a circle, like something heavy had been set down there. By the time we went back to look later, the tide had come in and washed over the spot. Since then, the hum has returned on and off, never as strong as before. People still talk about it quietly. Someone at the shop, a guy fixing his car on the road, but nobody makes a big thing of it. I haven't seen the glow again, and I've never heard Callum mention that craft a second time. I still live in the cottage. Most nights are normal, but when the hum starts up, even faintly, I notice the dog on the hill across from me bark for a few seconds, then go silent. The gulls drift off, and the seals slip into the water. The whole area feels like it's holding its breath. I'll step outside sometimes, stand by the edge, and listen. It's always the same, low, steady, with no clear source. Some nights it seems farther away, other nights like it's right under my feet. I've tried recording it on my phone, but the sound never comes through, just wind. I haven't gone back to the exact spot where the glow appeared. I could, but I don't. When the hum starts, I stay inside, lights off, and wait for it to fade. Eventually, it always does. Then the seals return, the dog barks again, and the sea sounds like the sea. We were hiking out past Queen City Summit, near the edge of the Nevada Test and Training Range. Not on the base itself, obviously, but close enough that the signs got real serious. Bright yellow metal ones with warnings about deadly force and hidden sensors. We weren't trying to mess with anything. We just wanted to camp for a couple nights, stargaze, maybe catch a glimpse of something weird. It was me, my cousin Tyler, and his friend Marco. Tyler's a machinist in Sacramento, real into aerospace stuff. Marco's a little more of a conspiracy guy, flat brim hat, infrared scope, the whole deal, but mostly harmless. I'm not really into that scene, but I like hiking and I had a long weekend, so I figured why not. We parked off a dirt road east of Rachel, hiked in about 6 miles along a dry wash. It was early March, chilly but not freezing. No clouds, no moon, just a thick canopy of stars. We set up camp behind a rock formation that blocked most of the wind, built a little fire, cooked sausages and canned beans. Just a normal desert night. Around 11 p.m., Marco started scanning the sky with his monocular. Tyler was fiddling with a homemade antenna thing he'd built to pick up air traffic control signals. I was just lying back on my pad looking at Orion. That's when we heard it. At first I thought it was a bee, or maybe an electric fence nearby. Just a soft buzzing, kind of high-pitched but mechanical. It wasn't coming from the ground. It felt like it was in the air around us. Not loud, but steady. Tyler sat up and said, "You hear that?" Marco nodded but didn't say anything. He was already pointing the monocular up toward the ridge behind us. I stood and looked too. At first I didn't see anything, just stars. But then 3 of them moved. They were in a triangle shape, equal distance from each other, low in the sky. The lights were white but not bright. Dimmer than aircraft strobes. They didn't blink, just hovered there, totally still. Then the buzzing got louder. Not dramatically, just a notch higher, like an old fluorescent bulb kicking on. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera. It wouldn't start, just froze on the loading screen. I tried backing out, tried switching to the flashlight, nothing. The screen was still lit, but no apps worked. Tyler's phone wouldn't even turn on. He held down the power button and just shook his head. "It's dead," he said, like he didn't believe it. Marco had a little hand crank flashlight. He turned it on and pointed it up, just to see if it would reflect anything. The second he did, the buzzing stopped. The triangle of lights began to drift sideways. Not fast, just a slow, deliberate glide, like it was tracking along an invisible rail. No tilt, no wobble, no trail behind it. We watched it move for maybe 20 seconds, and then it vanished. Not like it zipped away, not like it dimmed out. It just blinked off. Gone. The buzzing didn't come back. The stars looked normal again. We stood there in silence for a long time. Nobody reached for their phone again. Eventually we sat by the fire. Nobody said much. Marco went into his tent early. Tyler just poked at the coals and kept glancing at the sky. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I checked my phone again. It was fine. Battery at 82%, apps working. Photos, flashlight, everything. I didn't sleep much that night. Next morning, Marco said he'd tried to take a picture too. Claimed his screen went green and made a clicking noise before shutting off. His phone wouldn't boot until we were halfway back to the car. We didn't report anything. Not sure who we'd report it to anyway. All I know is we saw something, and for whatever reason, none of our gear worked while it was happening. I was assigned to the Lordsburg station out in New Mexico, which covers a stretch of the high desert west of Las Cruces. That was back in 2016. Most of our shifts were long and quiet, just miles of sand and scrub with the occasional group coming through or a busted truck we had to check out. My name's Ramon Diaz. I'd been on the job about 6 years at that point. I worked mostly nights, running surveillance from the mobile towers or monitoring the FLIR feeds back at base. Nothing fancy. A couple pan-tilt zoom cameras mounted on extendable masts, tied to thermal and IR. We'd park them on ridges and let them scan the desert in wide arcs. This happened mid-July, around 2 a.m. It was one of those nights where the heat never really dropped. High 80s even after midnight. No breeze, just the kind of dry air that sticks in your throat. I was out with my partner, Alex Trujillo. We were manning one of the forward towers up near Animas. Pretty flat land out there, broken up by low ridges and arroyos. Nothing but creosote and hard-packed sand as far as you could see. We'd set the tower up around dusk and parked the truck in a cut just below it. Most of the night was uneventful. A few jackrabbits, a small group trying to move northeast. We called it in. A team picked them up easy. After that, it went dead quiet again. Around 2:10, I was watching the IR feed while Alex was in the truck catching some rest. The camera was scanning east, low on the horizon, just tracing the slope of a shallow wash. Then it pinged something, a heat source, coming up slow out of the dark. I figured coyote at first, or maybe a mule deer, but it wasn't right. Whatever it was standing, upright, walking, and it was hot. Not body temp warm, but white hot on the feed, like it had just come out of an oven. At first, it was just a shimmer in the distance, hard to make out, but as it moved closer, maybe 200 yards from the lens, the shape became clearer. 2 arms, 2 legs, head forward. Human-shaped, no question, but off. The proportions were wrong, legs too long, arms hanging low, and it didn't move like a person. No sway, no bounce, just smooth. I tried to lock the camera, but the auto track froze. Screen flickered for a second. When it came back, it was closer, way closer. It had covered 100 yards in what couldn't have been more than 2 seconds. I backed out of the zoom, thinking the system was glitching. I checked our secondary feed, the wide angle. Nothing there. The regular night vision cam wasn't picking it up, only IR. I radioed Alex to get up. I said, "You need to come look at this." He didn't answer right away, so I ran back to the truck, maybe 30 feet from the base of the tower. He was sitting up, rubbing his face. I told him something was out there, someone or something walking in fast from the south wash. He followed me to the monitor, but by the time we got back, it was gone. Just gone. We rewound the feed. There it was. The shape moving up from the edge of the frame, heat signatured, glowing like steel. Then, just before it would have come into full view of the secondary cam, it stopped. It crouched. That was the only way I can describe it. Like a squat. Then the image warped for a split second, like static. Next frame, nothing. It didn't walk away. It didn't fall. Just wasn't there. Alex thought I was screwing with him. I told him to check the system logs. They were clean, no errors, no loss of signal. We stepped outside and scanned the desert with binoculars. Nothing. Dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I decided to check the area where the thing appeared, maybe 300 yards from the tower. Took the truck, drove slow. We had thermal scopes, side-mounted lights. The ground was flat, hard-packed, no brush tall enough to hide behind. No footprints, not even disturbed sand. We did a full perimeter sweep, nothing turned up. We spent the rest of the shift watching that stretch, eyes glued to the screen. The IR was working fine, picked up rabbits, even a snake slithering out of a bush, but nothing even close to what we'd seen before. Next day, I pulled the recording and tagged it for review. Our supervisor Harris watched it once, then just nodded and said he'd send it up the chain. He didn't ask for details, didn't look surprised, didn't mention it again. A week later, I checked the archive. That clip was gone. Whole night's footage labeled as corrupted. Same with the backup drive. That was the last time I worked with that tower. Alex put in for a transfer 2 months later. He didn't say why, but I knew. We didn't talk about it again. Neither of us ever told anyone outside the station. But I still think about that shape, the way it moved. Like it wasn't made for our terrain, but was using it anyway, just for a little while. I was out on the lake because that's where my head went when I needed to stop thinking. I'd been working 12-hour shifts at the plant for months, and the couch at home had started to feel like a trap. The boat was quiet. Old wooden hull, a cheap Coleman lantern in the bow for when the fog rolled in, and the dock light at the cabin was turned off so the bugs wouldn't swarm. It was late, past midnight, and the moon was thin and low, silver like a coin. The air off the water was suddenly sharp and clean after the summer heat. The sort of cold that made me pull the collar of my jacket up. I'd been casting for an hour, pulling in nothing but smallmouth and my own restless thoughts. The lake that night was one of those mirror lakes that copy the sky perfectly. Stars dotted the black top like ash. Wind wasn't enough to make a ripple, and the only sound besides my line hitting the water was the occasional creak of the boat and the frogs thumping the far reeds. I remember the first odd thing was the fish. I'd been watching the line bob for longer than usual and noticed the strike indicator twitching. Soft, polite, like a cat pawing at a curtain. Then the water right around the boat started to ripple in concentric circles, small and even, like someone was skipping stones out past the lilies. Only there was no stone and nothing on the surface. The ripples moved toward me and then spread past the gunwale and died. No splash, no sound. It felt like the lake cleared its throat. I sat still. I told myself this was normal. Insects under the skin of the water, the wind in a funny pocket. I cast again. The bobber set down and the line hummed a different tone in the moonlight. The watch on my wrist suddenly jumped back 2 minutes. One of those little digital quirks you tell yourself is nothing and then look at twice. I checked my phone. It showed an alert saying no service, though I'd had a bar an hour earlier. I shut it and tucked it in my jacket like a talisman. Then, out toward the middle of the lake, something moved. At first I thought it was a bird. There was a bright smear of something skimming across the surface, far enough away that I couldn't make out what it was. But birds make sound, or at least flap, and this thing made nothing. It skimmed like someone had dragged a marble across a sheet of glass. The surface stayed flat, no splash, no wake, just a narrow silver track where the moonlight gleamed. It moved fast and sure, then slowed, then crossed an old marker buoy, and then it changed. That's the detail that stayed with me, the way its reflection folded. For a heartbeat, it was a perfect silver sphere skimming the water, small and bright, and then it flattened like a coin tossed flat across a table. It didn't ripple the water the way something touching would. It bent the light, and when the light bent, the stars behind it slid a half degree like someone had nudged the whole canvas. I'd fished most of my life. I knew the lake. I knew the way shadows sat on the water. I'd seen floating logs and litters and the occasional boat with a reflect strip. I'd never seen anything move like that, silent, precise, like a pebble rolling without touching. I thought about grabbing the cheap camcorder I carried for odd shots, but hands that had been steady for years suddenly shook enough that the tripod would have trembled. The sphere, if it was a sphere, circled once 50 yards from me and then moved again, as if it had been checking something. The pattern it traced was odd, like someone drawing circles with a ruler bent into a ring. I could see a hint of something metallic, like the moon was reflecting off polished chrome. The soundless motion made the lake feel enormous and very thin. Then it was gone. Not like it flew away, not with a whoosh. It just stopped being there. 1 second there was a silver line, the next the water read like a page with the line erased. The ripples faded. The frogs resumed as if they'd been on a break. I sat in my boat, holding the rod until my arms cramped, waiting for the water to betray the rest of the story. I got back to the cabin at dawn before the sun because the boat ride kept the adrenaline from settling and I needed to move under my own power. The boards creaked as I tied up. The dog, Abby, did her small, irritated bark as if I'd been late to feed her. I tried to tell Mary, the lake's owner, neighbor, and a friend who had a rough laugh and even rougher coffee, but words kept catching in my throat like someone had duct taped them. I said it anyway because you always say it aloud to see if it sounds ridiculous. A silver ball, she said when I got to her porch. She was practical in a way that made you feel ridiculous for worrying. At this hour, you sure you weren't dreaming? I was awake, I said. I had my rod out. I was watching. She chewed the inside of her cheek like she thought there might be an angle I was missing. Maybe a seal or something keeps coming in at night? She smiled in a way that let me know she didn't believe the idea. You old fools and your stories. I didn't go out that afternoon. I told myself I'd been spooked by too many late nights, that the brain was a trickster. But curiosity doesn't like to be snuffed by logic, so I went back out 2 nights later with a camcorder and a thermometer, and the thing I've always had, stubbornness. I sat in the same spot, the same light, and watched the middle of the lake like a blind man might watch for the sound of a door. There were other oddities. The pressure on my ears dropped twice, like we were in a plane for a second, and then back. My watch again slipped time like it had been nudged. My hand brushed the metal of the rod, and it felt slightly warm, not like it should in the cool night. Wood smoke from a distant house curled across the far shore and smelled of someone grilling too late. The water hummed in a way I couldn't place. At 11:48, the camcorder's LED flashed a battery icon. I swapped batteries, annoyed, then swore when I rewound earlier footage later and found a 30-second block missing. The tape had a gap like it had been cut. The camcorder didn't look tampered with. The casing was intact. The tape showed an image of the lake and then a jump, like someone erased a sentence from a paragraph. A week passed with nothing. I told less and less to Mary because her laugh had a way of stretching the thing smaller until it felt like an imagination failing. Around the same time, I noticed a car parked at the edge of the road by the tree line most mornings. Black, older sedan, no one visible. It was always there at dawn and gone by noon like it kept its hours. I photographed it once, and the picture came out grainy as if taken through a filter. Then, 2 nights after that, at around 2:30 a.m., I saw it again. The sphere came from the direction of the inlet and skimmed like before, closer this time, and when it passed near the dock, the water around the pilings flashed like someone had poured mercury in the air. I reached out, and my hand passed the air where the thing had been, and it felt colder than it had any right to. I was halfway across the boards before I realized Abby hadn't barked. She'd stayed asleep on the porch, not even twitching. The next day, I overcooked the bacon in the morning and put myself in the truck with 2 beers and drove into town to talk sense. The hardware store had a regular who liked to sit and nod, and when I said strange things, he nodded and told me about wind tunnels and glints off oil slicks. The sheriff just smiled and said, "You see anything suspicious besides the old sedan?" And I told him about the light and my missing footage and tried not to sound like I was leaning on a tall tale. "You keep telling yourself you're safe," he said, "and maybe that's all you need for now." He scratched the back of his neck and handed me a cup of coffee. I left with nothing. The men came 3 days after that. I saw them before I heard the truck. They were sitting on my porch swing when I pulled in late that night after some extra hours at the plant. The porch light was off. The 2 men were in black suits, clean and unwrinkled, though they'd been sitting outside. They had a sort of stillness about them, like they were wood carved to sit in the right way. One had a thin face with a nose that made you think he measured his words before he made them. The other had a wide jaw and sat slightly farther back, shoulders set. They weren't young. They weren't old. They looked like they'd been cut out of a sheet of the same gray cloth. My first instinct was to back the truck up and leave. My second was to unlock the door and act like I hadn't noticed because I didn't want to hand them the satisfaction of scaring me. That lasted about 6 steps. I walked to the porch, boots making the hollow sound of someone returning. "Evening," the thin-faced one said. His voice was flat, polite. "Mr. Cole?" "That's me," I said. My voice sounded like a man who had tried to hold on to his composure for too long. Can I help you? Mind if we sit? The wide-jawed one asked. We don't want to bother you. They spoke like that. No hurry, no small talk, as if everything was arranged ahead of time and they were simply arriving to fulfill the plan. I wanted to tell them to leave. I wanted to ask how they'd gotten my address. I wanted to tell them about the silver thing, the missing tape, the black car. I instead said nothing and sat down on the opposite end of the swing like we were doing something civil. They didn't look at the lake. They watched me in a way that felt like a thermometer might watch a patient, checking heat, checking color. I noticed their shoes, plain leather, without salt stains or grass bits. The thin-faced man's hands were folded across his knee. You fish at night a lot, he said finally. I do, I said. Stick to daytime, the wide-jawed man said, as if the phrase was a small kindness. Excuse me, I said. I didn't laugh. I didn't know which face to make when a stranger told me how to fish. The two of them smiled the way people do when they're choosing words carefully. There are elements that are more active at night, the thin man said. It's safer to be out in daylight. I understand, I said, and the words felt wrong in my mouth. I wanted to ask who they were, which agency, where they were from, why they were telling me this like a neighbor giving me a weather tip. But the thin man had a small silver card in his hand, and when he slid it across to me, I looked at it like a passerby might peer through a window. The card had an emblem and a reference code. No department I recognized. The numbers looked neat. Who are you? I asked finally. We're researchers, the wide man said. Field sampling. He leaned forward like he wanted to confide something that would make me feel better. Public safety. The words had weight. They were careful to sound like the sort of people you could file a complaint with. They weren't threats. They were instructions. If there's something out there bothering you, tell us, the thin man said. We can help document it. There's no need to be in harm's way. I've seen something, I said. A silver thing. On the water. The sentence cut off like a torn rope. It doesn't make sound. They nodded like men who took mental notes and didn't need to write them down. The wide man's hand moved to his pocket as if to take something out, and I flinched only because of old habits. He slid a pamphlet across to me instead. It was plain paper. Nocturnal Safety Advisory. Avoid nighttime activities near water. Someone had printed it for a reason. Someone who liked to keep things quiet. You sure you'll be all right going forward? The thin man asked. They phrased the question like a neighbor asking about a broken fence, as though they were offering community service. Do you work for the county? I asked. Do you have IDs? We're with a regional unit, the thin man said. We can provide contact information through official channels if you request it. He said it like the ball was in my court and he'd move if I asked. They stayed for 20 minutes. They asked about my boat, my routine, what bait I used. They asked about Abby and whether I kept a light on the dock. The questions were mundane in a way that made me want to answer with precise things you might scribble in a log. Dates, times, numbers. They took notes on a small pad without looking like men bothered by handwriting. When they left, they stood at the edge of the gravel lane and watched the tree line until I couldn't see them. After they left, I checked my camcorder and my tape and my watch and the little items on the shelf where I keep tackle. The missing block on the tape hadn't returned. On the shelf, my spare reel of line that had been full was a little less full, as if someone had unwound a length to examine the filament and then wound it back badly. Days after they came, the black sedan stopped appearing at the road. The man at the hardware store started to smile my way again. Mary stopped laughing at me and instead asked if I wanted coffee more often, like she was trying a different kind of kindness. I went out during the day for a while. There were fewer ripples, fewer odd pressure drops. The lake behaved like a lake. I told myself I was done with nights on the water. I told myself I had been lucky and that the men had helped. I told myself that a person could be careful and be fine. I kept the card in my wallet for a while, not to call, but because it felt like keeping the name of a doctor you'd rather not visit, but might need. I left the camcorder in the top drawer for months. Sometimes I'd take it out and press play and watch the footage until my patience wore thin, and the missing frames made me feel like I was watching someone edit my life. Once, long after the men left, I saw a glint on the water from the porch, no more than a sliver like a coin tilting at an angle, and I thought of that night. The dogs stared at the far shore and then went back to sleep. I told myself to stick to daylight, then laughed quietly at the memory of the wide man saying the phrase as if it were advice you took for granted until you didn't. I never saw the silver thing again. I never got a call from whoever those men were to confirm their credentials. The watch stopped hiccuping. The sedan didn't come back. Life fit back into its slow routine with the same small dramas. A fence needing mending, a generator that wouldn't start, a neighbor's kid bringing over a raccoon that had been saved from a trap. The Men in Black became a story you might tell someone when you wanted to sound like a man who paid attention to the world. Sometimes, when I launch the boat at midday and the breeze is right and the lake runs like a polished plate, I let the rod hang loose and watch the horizon. I try to imagine that it was a charm, a trick of the light, an animal doing something graceful. Other times, I think about the way it bent the stars for a heartbeat, and the way the men slid the card across like people who knew the rules but wanted to keep the noise down. It felt like a warning and a favor at the same time. The two of them on my porch swing telling me to fish in the daylight like a neighbor telling me to wear a jacket. I do what they asked. I leave the night for the owls and for the coyote that sings, and I go out when the sun is up, when the lake is loud with dragonflies and the kind of life that doesn't move like a cut coin. Some nights I still wake at 2 and listen, half expecting the water to clear its throat. I stand at the window and watch the dark and the line of birches that stops the view. I tell myself I'm safe if I stay inside with the lights on. And I keep the card in my wallet because there are things a man keeps not because he trusts them, but because he needs to remember who told him to be careful. I was cutting through a stretch of back road between Kayenta and Page, real empty country, red rock and dust, nothing but scrub and sky. It was late afternoon, but the sun was dropping fast behind the cliffs, turning everything orange and long-shadowed. I'd left Phoenix that morning and figured I'd stop for gas in Page, maybe grab a room if I got tired. The GPS had routed me onto this weird, narrow highway, State Route 98. It wasn't a road I'd ever taken, but it seemed faster than going around. My signal had cut out an hour earlier, but the map was still loaded, so I just kept going. I hadn't seen another car for a good 30 miles, not one. No billboards, no gas stations, no fences, just mesas and sand. It was almost peaceful until it wasn't. I first noticed it when I came over a rise and dipped into this shallow canyon. The road curved, then ran straight for a long stretch between two ridges. I checked my rear view, habit, I guess, and saw headlights, 2 of them. Close. I hadn't passed anyone. There were no turnoffs, no lights behind me for hours. But now, clear as day, someone was following me. I slowed down a little to let them catch up, thinking maybe it was a ranger or a local. But the lights kept the same distance, not gaining, not falling back, just there. I tapped my brakes a few times. Nothing. They didn't flash theirs or react in any way. The weirdest thing was I couldn't see the car, just the lights. Bright like high beams, but not blinding. They didn't bounce or shift like headlights usually do when someone's hitting bumps or small hills. They just floated there. Same height, same spacing, same brightness. Too steady. After a few miles of this, I figured maybe it was just a trick of the road. Maybe there was a truck on a different highway behind me, and the angle made it look like it was tailing me. I decided to pull over and let it pass. There was a gravel shoulder wide enough to stop, so I eased onto it, threw on my hazards, and waited. The lights kept coming. But here's the thing. When I looked in the side mirror, I didn't see anything. The rear view still showed the lights, but the side mirror, just empty desert. I even leaned out the window a little to check. Nothing there. That's when I realized there was no road behind me. Not anymore. I swear to God I'd just been driving that same stretch. Asphalt, yellow lines, the whole deal. But when I look back now, it was just scrub and rock. No pavement, no tire marks, just open land. I thought maybe I'd turned without noticing, like there'd been a split in the road. But no, my tires were still on asphalt. I even opened the door and stepped out. The wind was picking up, carrying that dry, hot smell you only get out there. I walked a few feet behind the car. No road. It didn't make sense. I should have been able to see it stretching back at least a few hundred feet, but it just wasn't there. It looked like the road started right under my back tires and didn't exist before that. I walked back to the driver's side and checked the mirror again. Still lights, still behind me. I climbed back in and started driving again. Not fast, just steady. I watched the mirror the whole time. The lights didn't follow, they stayed in the same spot. Then, after about 5 minutes, they were gone. No fade, no curve in the road to hide them, just gone. I didn't feel relief. I felt watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I knew nothing was there. Another few miles passed, the sun was nearly down now, and the whole desert looked flat and gray. That's when my headlights flickered. Once, twice, then stayed on. I tapped the dash, probably just a loose wire, I figured. The rental had been making a weird sound since I picked it up. A minute later, the engine made this soft whining noise like it was straining. RPMs dipped. The whole car jerked once, then smoothed out. That's when I saw movement up ahead. Something crossed the road. Quick, low to the ground. I only caught it in my peripheral vision. Might have been a coyote, but it didn't move like one. It didn't run. It sort of glided. I slowed down to look, but there was nothing. No prints, no shape disappearing into the brush. The air felt weird, heavy. Not hot anymore, just thick. Then the static started. It came through the speakers, even though the radio was off. Just a low hiss, barely noticeable, but rising. Like a storm was nearby. I turned the knob, nothing changed. Tried to shut the stereo off completely, but it didn't respond. The hiss kept building until it suddenly cut out. Silence. That's when I noticed the sky. It wasn't dark yet, not fully, but the stars were already out, except above me. Directly overhead, there was this perfect circle of empty sky. No stars, just blank. It didn't look like a cloud. It was too precise, too still. I kept driving. A mile or two later, I saw lights again, but not behind me this time, off to the side, maybe half a mile out, floating low over the desert. Two of them, close together, moving slow. I figured it might be a drone or a tower, but then they split. One went left, one went right. Both rose at the same time, then dropped in sync, then vanished. I pulled over again. I needed to breathe. When I stepped out, I noticed this faint humming. Not from the car, from the air. It was high-pitched and constant, like the sound you hear when a TV's on in another room. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and then I heard something behind me. A soft crunch. I spun around. Nothing. Another crunch. Closer. I didn't see anything, but I swear something was moving through the brush, just out of sight. I got back in the car and locked the doors, took off down the road faster than I probably should have. Eventually, I saw a sign for Page, still about 20 miles out. The road widened a bit, and I started seeing the occasional fence post or light in the distance. Civilization creeping back in. The second I hit town limits, everything stopped. The static, the humming, the weird pressure in the air. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the lot for 10 minutes before getting out. Just stared at the lights, the other people, the pavement. Normal things. I looked behind me. The road was there, plain as day. 2 lanes, yellow stripes, tire marks, everything. But I checked the car's trip meter. The mileage didn't line up with where I should have been. I should have driven about 130 miles that day. The meter said 89. I was halfway through the last cold beer when Gus stopped mid-chew and stared up. We had the little patio light on and the sprinkler set to the front lawn, the kind of late summer night that makes your skin feel like it's holding on to the day. My wife was at a friend's and I'd promised myself a quiet hour outside before collapsing into bed. Gus, boxer mutt, ridiculous paws, the only dog I've ever known to snore like a tractor, was stretched on his back next to my chair, legs in the air, the way he always was when he was absolutely content. He froze like someone had hit pause on him. His ears went straight up. I tipped my head and followed his line of sight. Above the maple at the end of the yard, the stars looked wrong. Not brighter, not dimmer. Wrong the way a misplaced note sounds in a familiar song. A handful of them were no longer fixed points. They were sliding, slowly together like leaves drifting on a stream. The cluster moved as one, a tidy group, and it crossed the sky as if it had a route it'd practiced. At first I thought it might be satellites. I've watched those slow chains before, phone constellations, I think, the neighborhood kids used to call them, but these weren't linear. They kept roughly the same distance between each other, like they were keeping formation, and they moved in a curve that was too smooth to be aircraft at that altitude. The motion wasn't quick. It took maybe 3 minutes for the cluster to drift from the maple over toward the old radio tower to the south. When it stopped, the group sat in a new arrangement, one of those small, dumb rearrangements that makes your eye expect something to match, and it doesn't. Gus didn't budge from his belly. He nosed his head under the porch step and wouldn't come out even when I whistled. That was the first real skin prickle moment. My dog, who will fetch a lawn chair for an audience, refusing his own yard. Before the stars started moving, I had noticed a couple of other small wrong things, and I'm the kind of person who notices small wrong things. The radio in the kitchen that sits on the window shelf and plays oldies all the time had given a single thin burst of static that sounded almost like a voice, and then went quiet as if someone had taken the station away. The digital clock over the stove blinked 11:07, then skipped to 11:10 when I went in to get another beer. I told myself it was a power blip or the cheap clock losing its mind, and I left the porch light on for company. Those are the sensible explanations you reach for in the beginning. The dogs in the neighborhood went from their usual evening barks to a kind of high, single note, and then nothing. I noticed that because across the fence, old Mrs. Fenley's terrier, the one that yaps at our cat, usually keeps tenacious hours, and that night he cut off the same second Gus stared. The sounds snapped off like the world had been muted a notch. The breeze that had been moving the maple leaves died out. The night pressed closer, lighter somehow. The stars shone plain. Then that handful of them glided. I tried to get a photo. I've got a decent phone, newer model, and it usually handles night sky pictures better than I do. My thumb fumbled and my screen filled with a little spinning circle of loading for a beat, and then the camera app closed. I opened it again, and the image I took came out like a smear. More like someone had taken Vaseline to the lens than anything actually captured. Same thing when I pointed Gus's little LED collar at the sky. The collar made a weak halo on the porch wood, but did nothing to the moving points above. The stars didn't respond to light. The cluster paused, and then, without looking like they accelerated, the stones in the sky shifted again and rearranged themselves into a line that wasn't a line, and then a compact shape, not a picture I knew. They settled like someone had set them down with a finger. I felt the urge to stand up and call somebody, because that's what you do when your brain wants proof. But I also felt the opposite urge, to stay perfectly still in the middle of a familiar backyard and watch what your eyes were telling you. My watch, cheap wristwatch, battery a year old, showed 11:14 when the stars began moving, and because I compulsively check it in a night like this, 11:17 when they stopped. I remembered the radio clock skipping earlier, and I told myself the watch was wrong. Later, I checked the microwave, and it said 11:14, and the app on my phone, once it stopped gyrating, agreed. Time felt one of those elastic things for a minute, the way a dream stretches an hour into a second. I didn't black out. I noted the seconds. The stitch was small but visible, like thread that doesn't quite match the rest of the cloth. Neighbors came out, not a lot, just the people who sleep with their windows open or keep their barbecue lights on. A half-dozen heads poked from porches along the street, and we did that shapeless communal thing. We squinted up, said, "You seeing this?" and nodded at each other like we were all seeing the same hallucination and willing it into common sense. Nobody seemed afraid enough to call the police. The sort of wrongness that could be filed under weird but not urgent crept up the street. When the cluster stopped, one of the stars wobbled a little and brightened, and for a second I thought it might be a meteor. It steadied though, and the brightness subsided. The new arrangement looked deliberate, like an arrangement someone had designed to be seen but not explained. I thought about how small we are under the sky, and how that fact doesn't change the teeth of the feeling. You can say it's awe, and that's fine and true, but there's something else, a hush that sits over your skin. Gus stayed under the porch. He let me come close and scratch his neck. But when I reached for the leash, he shifted deeper back into shadow and put his big chin on a step and refused. He wuffed softly and wrapped his paws over the top one like he was holding on. I ended up letting the leash drag behind a shoe because I couldn't make him stand. He trembled once and then was still again. He looked at me like he was deciding whether or not to trust his person. I decided to go next door and ask Mrs. Fenley if she'd seen anything. On the walk over there, the streetlights blinked in a pattern, one small blink every 3 seconds, then steady. The light pattern made me think of an old theater sign. She opened her door and let me stand in the porch light, the kind of solid lamp that made everyone's faces too white, and when I asked if she'd seen it, she nodded, slow. "They were moving," she said. "Not like anything I recall. My Harold," she tapped her chest where she keeps his wedding ring in a pocket. "He called it a dance," said not to worry. She paused, like she'd reconsidered something unsaid, and then added, "But Rufus wouldn't go out to pee all night. Wouldn't even look at the yard." Her terrier was, she said, trembling in a corner behind the fern. I told her Gus was on my porch, and she seemed to think that made sense, as if animals were tuned into a channel we barely hear. We went back to our yards. The cluster had rearranged again into a pattern I didn't have words for, like a constellation someone had redrafted for a different sky. My phone on the kitchen counter finally got a text from my sister. "You outside? My feed is wild." And when I opened it, there were a handful of clip messages from other friends saying they'd been watching too. Not everyone had seen them. Not everyone wanted to talk about it. The ones who did used a lot of the same phrasing, like a handful moved together. The dogs went funny. I tried to get more pictures. The second attempt, the camera app behaved like it had something loaded. It didn't want to show me. A buffer loop of black frames and one where a pale smear crossed the image and then the file corrupted. I uploaded the corrupted file to a cloud thing on autopilot and the upload failed. It was small, inconvenient technology failing, but it always feels like proof's the first thing to go when the world flexes. By midnight, the neighbors had drifted back indoors. Lights turned off one by one. Music behind windows started up again. The street resumed its quiet, the air a little cooler than before. Gus stayed under the porch. I brought him a blanket from inside and set it down near his head. He let me lay it and then folded himself deeper into the shadow. I sat for a long time after that, not sure whether I was waiting for anything or hoping nothing else would happen. The cluster eventually dispersed. The stars returned to their regular, gorgeous, stubborn points. The night did what nights always do. It let you think there's continuity again. Gus didn't move until dawn. He did come back into the house when Jenna's alarm went off next morning. She came over after my wife told her I'd seen something strange, and he trotted in like nothing was wrong. He slept nearly all day the way dogs do after a long night. I did what people do in these situations. I told the story in pieces to Mrs. Fenley, to Jenna, to a coworker who raised his eyes and said, "Huh, weird," and then to my wife when she came home that afternoon. We walked the yard at dusk the next night, us all looking up, and nothing repeated. The maple's leaves turned, the streetlights hummed in their usual way, and the sprinklers kept to their schedule. There's no tidy ending. Gus will sleep on the porch sometimes now when the evening smells like rain, but he never stretches fully out under the stars like he used to. He keeps one eye open, and if I glance up at the sky and see a pattern that's just slightly off, one that might be a plane, or might be a group of satellites, or might be nothing, my first instinct is to hunch my shoulders and call him in. The memory of the stars moving stays like a small ache in the back of my throat, easy to ignore until something else nudges it. I make coffee in the mornings, check the clocks, and go to work. Life holds its edges in place. The dog lies under the porch and watches, and that feels like reason enough to look up. I was on the balcony having a cigarette because it was one of those nights my apartment felt too small with the TV off. The city was soft, distant horns, an ambulance wafting by 2 blocks away, half the streetlights humming like old refrigerators. I'd been watching the office tower across from mine for a while, the big glass one on 7th and H that lights up like a mini skyline. People work there in shifts. You get used to the slow pulse of lights moving up and down its face as cleaning crews and late programmers go home. Little things had been off all evening, though I didn't really register them at first. The elevator in my building stuck between floors for 20 minutes earlier, and the neighbor knocked on the shaft door forgetting where he was. He swore it was a tech problem. Carlos, the super, came out later with a flashlight and some shrugging. The bodega on the corner played the same 2 songs on loop for an hour and then went completely silent for 10 minutes. My phone gave me a brazen no service alert 3 separate times, and when I finally got signal, there were half a dozen texts asking if anyone else's clocks had jumped. I figured some transformer had a hiccup. City living has a lot of hiccups. The tower across the street had this company logo up near the top, neon, white. It's supposed to go dim after midnight. Tonight it was on, the letters bright, and when I watched them, the light hummed a little like the rest of the city lights do. I took the smoke slow and listened to the building's rhythm. There was the distant mechanical thrum of HVAC from a few blocks over, a pigeon somewhere claiming a ledge, Mrs. Patel downstairs calling her son on speaker, and laughing in a way that made me feel less alone. Then, the glow appeared. It wasn't a dot like a plane or a blip like a helicopter's landing lights. It was a white, almost surgical light that hung just over the top floors of the tower, not above or around, like someone had parked a bright lamp right above the building roof. It moved very slowly, less than what I think of as movement in the air, more like a wash that slid along the edge of the clouds. The first thing I noticed was how clean it looked against the night. A compact oval of light with a soft edge, not blasting, just there. The neon logo dimmed a fraction under it as if the glow stole some of its attention. I told myself it was a maintenance lift or something. Working at height with a spotlight to patch a sign. People do that at weird hours. I called my friend Jenna, who works nights at the hospital, said, "You up?" And she replied with a sleepy, "Yeah." And then, because she knows me, "You see anything weird?" I told her about the glow, and she laughed, said maybe someone's got a drone. But her laughter had a hollow cut to it, and she asked a detail I hadn't thought of. "Does it make noise?" I strained my ears. Nothing. Not a mechanical whine, not a rotor chop, just the city's bass line and the soft scrape of my cigarette between my fingers. A minute later, the glow flickered. It was a tiny shuddering at first, like someone flipping a switch quickly. Then there was a soft, uncanny pause. The kind of pause that makes you notice the refrigerator too loud and your own heartbeat. In that pause, every window in that tower went dark at once. I mean, every single one. The entire face of the building that had looked like a spread of lit rooms contracted into one shuttered silhouette. For a beat, I thought the transformer had failed. Then I looked at the other blocks and saw their lights still steady, taxis crawling past, people on the sidewalk talking on phones. It was just the tower. The dark was absolute and exactly simultaneous. No slow fade, no row-by-row blackout like when power companies shut lines down. It was a cut blink off. I raised my phone to record because you do that reflexively. The screen came up, the app opened, and the image stuttered into a smear. My phone logged no service again for a second and then came back. By the time I had the camera running, the tower lights had returned like nothing at all had happened. The neon sign shot back to its bright self as if someone had flicked the lights on. People in the street didn't scream or scatter. A woman on the corner who'd been smoking turned and kept smoking. 30 seconds, maybe less, of darkness, and then nothing. If you'd blinked, you would have missed it. My first impulse was to ask someone else if they'd seen it, so I leaned over the rail and called down to my neighbor Max, 2 floors below. He was the kind of guy who's up late and feeds pigeons on his window ledge, so he's awake for weird. "Hey, did you just see the tower?" I shouted. Max poked his head out, and I could see the glow of his TV inside his room, his hair all over. "What the blackout?" he asked, like I was behind on the neighborhood gossip. "Yeah, whole building went dark. I thought they were filming a movie up there." He didn't sound alarmed. He was trying to make himself not alarmed. I went downstairs. In the lobby, Carlos the Super was standing with his hand on the intercom. He'd been watching the street through the glass, and he was frowning, like people do when they've seen too many stop signs change at once. Power dropped and came back. he said without being asked. But only at that building. My cousin says sometimes when they test emergency systems in office towers, they do a quick whole building switchover. That sounded plausible. I tried to imagine maintenance crews with bright lamps and tool belts up top and accepted the idea because adults invent plausible things to sleep at night. Back on the sidewalk, the building looked ordinary. The lobby doors were open, people came and went, and a trio of late shift coders smoked under the awning and argued about an app they were debugging. One of them said, "My wife texted me from the 22nd floor and said the lights went out and then came back." No one screamed or anything? Weird, right? And then the conversation slid back to bugs in the build like nothing odd had just occurred. I called Jenna again, and this time she was awake enough to be sharp. "Hospitals got a string of alarms go off for about 20 minutes, she said, but they were just the UPS test. People call in weird all the time. I asked if her hospital had any staff that night working in that exact tower. She said no, different area code. She told me to stop being dramatic. I wanted to be done with it. That's another thing you learn. If you overfixate on a small impossibility, it takes up a corner of your thinking like a bad splinter. Still, I couldn't shake the way the dark had come, like a single hand over a lamp. The simultaneity made it feel like someone had reached across a building and turned off rooms as if they were light bulbs on a long string. Phones started to pick up again, properly an hour later. People posted pictures to social apps, flat images of a bright building and no visual evidence of the cut because most phones caught it either too early or too late. A tech blog had a short note from someone claiming the building's backup generator had tripped during a test, and everything was nominal. The building manager tweeted something corporate feeling. Brief, isolated power interruption resolved. The tweet used the word resolved in a way that is supposed to end conversations, but there were too many small, wedged details that didn't fit the tidy explanation. The smoke shop's camera feed near the intersection had gone dead for exactly 34 seconds, time-stamped, then returned as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Patel, who's always up at weird hours, swore she'd seen shadows moving inside the tower before the lights went out, like curtains shifting though the rooms were empty on that side. Max told me his building's lobby clock blinked once and then read a minute ahead for the rest of the night. My own wristwatch had a second hand that caught a beat later than it should have the next morning, like the day had hiccuped. A week passed, and the tower was its same illuminated self during the evenings. People went to work in it, cleaned it, left it, and walked under its awning without mentioning the cut, unless prompted. The city has a way of swallowing oddness into its routines. Still, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd stand on the balcony with nothing but the cold railing in my fingers and watch the block, counting the lit windows like a man counting sheep. Sometimes a pattern of lights would wink out in one office and then come back, like the old building was breathing, and I would blink back to steady myself. I never heard a siren that night for the tower. No emergency crews, no clamber of boots. If there was maintenance, it was quiet, precise, and handled with corporate calm. I emailed the building's management asking if they'd run tests. The only reply I got back was a boilerplate note. Routine maintenance and systems checks may occur. No impact to tenant operations. They thanked me for my patience. I came back inside after the first night and locked the balcony door behind me. I made a cup of coffee, pacing like a person who had seen something and wants it to be sensible. I sat at my table and watched the coffee steam like it marked time. My apartment felt like the rest of the city, functional, noisy in the right corners, indifferent. I slept eventually and kept schedules, paid rent, went to work. The tower's lights still blink and dim in that ordinary way. Once in a while they go dark for a second and then are back. Nothing official to tell you it isn't only your imagination. The thing I can't shake isn't that I saw a glow or that the windows darkened. It's the way everything lined up like a sentence and then left a blank where comprehension should have been. You tell yourself reasonable things, testing, a power hiccup, camera glitches, because you have to live here. But sometimes when I stand on the balcony, cigarette finished, and the city hums its low life around me, I find myself looking at that tower the way you keep an eye on a storm passing slow over the water. Not in fear, not in hope, but because it's a slice of the world behaving slightly off its script, and for reasons I don't have words for, I want to keep watching until the sentence makes sense. I was flying a charter run out of Billings, Montana late one evening in September. Nothing fancy, just a Beechcraft Baron, 2 passengers in the back heading to Bismarck for business the next morning. I'd done that route a dozen times. The weather wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. Scattered clouds at about 7,000 feet, mild crosswinds, visibility a little hazy but workable. It was the kind of night where you have to pay attention, but nothing that set off any alarms in my head. We leveled off around 9,500 feet, just above the first cloud deck, and the ride was smooth. The passengers were quiet. I remember glancing back once and seeing both of them leaning against the windows, half asleep. I settled in for what I thought would be an uneventful hop. About 40 minutes in, I noticed a light through the haze. At first, I figured it was another plane. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of regional jets crisscrossing the northern plains at night. But then another light appeared, a little lower and off to the side, and then a third one higher above. They weren't blinking like aircraft strobes. They were steady, pale white, almost bluish. What got me wasn't the fact that they were there. It was the way they locked into a perfect triangle, sharp as if someone had drawn it with a ruler. My eyes kept darting between my instruments and the windshield, trying to make sense of it. I gave it a few minutes, thinking maybe I was just catching glimpses of stars through holes in the clouds. But they didn't move the way stars should. They shifted together, holding formation, sliding in and out of the cloud edges. I finally clicked on the radio. Minneapolis Center, this is November 265 Delta Bravo. I've got traffic off my 11 o'clock, altitude unknown. Can you confirm? There was a pause, some static, then the controller came back. 265 Delta Bravo, negative contact, nothing showing near your position. I frowned, checked my transponder, checked the radar display. Clean. Nothing. But outside, those 3 lights were still there, crisp against the haze. I tried again. Center. I'm seeing 3 distinct lights forming a triangle, roughly 5 miles out, holding steady. Are you sure there's no traffic? Same answer. Nothing on radar, no transponder signals. I wanted to believe I was mistaken. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric reflection, something bouncing off the cloud tops. But as I watched, the lights began to rotate. Not individually, the whole triangle pivoted in place, like it was on an invisible turntable. It was so precise, so smooth that my stomach dropped. I remember glancing back at the passengers. They were still out, heads lolled, completely unaware. I thought about waking them, but something in me hesitated. I didn't want to sound insane, shouting about triangles in the clouds. I switched frequencies to Bismarck approach just to see if I'd get a different response. Same thing. They told me there was no traffic within 10 miles of me. The guy even asked if maybe I was seeing distant lightning. I knew I wasn't. Then it got weirder. The lights dimmed, one by one, until they were barely visible, like embers under ash. I exhaled, thinking it was finally over, when suddenly they reappeared twice as bright, in the exact same spots. My instruments didn't budge. No warnings, no interference, nothing. But the pit in my chest kept tightening. I tried to focus on my heading, my altitude. Flying the plane had to come first, but every 30 seconds or so my eyes slid back to the window. The lights started to drift upward into the thicker clouds above me, until all I could see was a faint glow bleeding through the vapor. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20. My sense of time got fuzzy. At one point, I thought I saw the clouds themselves light up, like the glow was pulsing through them from the inside. There were no sharp flashes, no thunder, no sound at all. Just a silent, steady pulse, 3 points breathing together in the mist. When they finally faded for good, I kept expecting them to come back. I stayed keyed up, watching the clouds, waiting for another flicker. Nothing. The rest of the flight was silent, except for the usual radio chatter. When we landed in Bismarck, the passengers thanked me like it had been any other flight. They didn't mention seeing anything strange, and I didn't bring it up. I signed off the plane, went through the usual checks, and drove to the cheap hotel the company always stuck me in. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the floor, wondering if I'd really seen what I thought I had. I filed the incident as unidentified traffic sighting, but when the report came back, there was nothing attached to it. No radar blips, no corroborating data. Just my own words. To this day, I can still picture that triangle, perfectly balanced, turning in the clouds like it didn't belong there. And I still don't know how something that clear, that solid, could show up for me and not for the instruments. I pulled over on a rutted 2-track when the sky went weird. I'd been chasing the cell all afternoon, hot, muggy air bulging off the highway, the kind of late May day that makes the whole sky feel like it's waiting. My name's Ben. I do freelance storm work with a beat-up Subaru and a dash cam that's seen better storms. I wasn't out for a record or fame, just the next decent wall cloud and whatever footage I could stitch together for the weather shows. The field off County Road 12 had a dark, low bass, and the wind had that tight metallic smell before anything obvious happened. I killed the engine, put the camera on the hood, and watched. A few small things felt off before anything really happened. First, the birds. The swallows that had been skimming over a drainage ditch 2 minutes earlier vanished like someone closed a curtain. It wasn't just quieter. The entire layer of little flight calls stopped dead. Then my radio started to hiss. Not the usual chatter, but a thin, high static that would climb and fall without a pattern. My phone, which had been steady on full bars, flashed "no service" for a beat, and then came back as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was all normal: atmospheric propagation, ionospheric weirdness, whatever the forecasters say when radios play up. But my gut notice is old at this. I've been out on nights where storms behaved normally, and nights where they didn't. And that bird silence was the sort that tightens your shoulders. The wall cloud dropped fast. 1 minute, the base was low and things smooth. The next, it had a lip and a darker core. Wind gusted from the southeast, and the tall corn in the fields lay flat in sheets. I could hear the blades of the grass snap under pressure in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I threw the dash cam at the windshield mount, which doesn't do much but keeps a steady picture for whatever I catch. That's when the funnel dropped. Thin at first, then thickening like someone had pulled taffy. It didn't look cinematic. It looked practical. A rope of condensed cloud with dust beginning to spiral at its base. Trucks on the far county road slowed to a crawl. A farmer in a pickup turned off his lights and parked on the shoulder. He waved at me like we were sharing a private thing of necessity. And then the lights appeared. Inside the pipe, maybe halfway up the visible column, 3 lights were locked in place. They weren't strobes or aircraft nav lights. They were steady, sharp, white, arranged roughly in a triangle with one point downward. The funnel was whipping and tearing at the field, and the air around it had teeth, but those lights sat steady as a lamp on a table. They didn't jitter with the gusts. They didn't smear with the speed of the rotation. It looked wrong in the exact, precise way that makes every hair on your neck honest. I raised my camera and zoomed until the image pixelated. The lights held. My recorder picked up nothing different. No extra frequencies, no mechanical whine. Just the ambient roar of wind and distant thunder. I got out of the car because that's what you do. You want the unobstructed angle, the sound that fills the chest. The porch of old corn and telephone poles leaned under the pressure of the storm. When I walked forward, the grit of soil was knocked at my boots like little bullets. A bolt hit to my left, bright, close, and it cracked the world open like a fist. The 3 lights vanished the instant the lightning lanced through the column. 1 fraction of a second they were there, the next nothing in that exact patch of sky. The funnel went on. No dramatic collapse at that moment, but the memory of those lights had a kind of absence, the shape of a hand. I blinked hard and checked the footage. The file shows the funnel and then a bright flash, and then the funnel continuing without its interior lights. After the strike, the whole storm acted like a thing embarrassed. Winds shifted, the gust front rolled through, and what had been a steady climb of electricity dropped into regular thunder. The radio that had been hissing came back to life with a dispatcher asking for reports. My phone chirped a dozen messages from other chasers. Did you see that? Lights inside? One text had a shaky clip from a passenger in another car. The lights are visible on a few frames and then gone. People started to respond in real time, trading coordinates and guesses like a sport. I drove closer when the funnel moved off the field and the county patrol waved traffic away. The farmer's truck was gone. He'd already headed to his cellar. I parked under a telephone pole because it felt safer for reasons I couldn't explain and watched the cloud pull east. For a long time afterward, all the small electronics around me behaved like a fridge motor. They hummed and clicked, a beat late. My headlamp dimmed for a second when I tried to jog video on a small handheld, and the minute it came back, the footage had a single frame where the lights were bright and then nothing. People in town called it later a power surge, a trick of light. I called it what it was, the footage in my camera and the farmer's dash cam backing me up. The National Weather Service logged an event. A tornado touchdown reported no fatalities, property damage minimal. They didn't say anything about 3 steady lights in a rotating column. Official reports don't usually do that. I sent the raw clip to a couple of meteorologist friends, and one of them emailed me back with a cautious, interesting. Glints off hail, maybe? With a shrug emoji. Another asked for GPS timestamps. I packed up before the storm could remind me how small we are. Driving back to the county line, the field smelled like wet iron and corn, and something clung to the air that my chest kept trying to measure. I was tired in the way people are after close, precise fear, awake and too alert. I went home, unloaded the rig, and watched the footage again on my laptop with the sound down, pausing at the frames where the lights sat like frozen buds inside the funnel. I posted a clipped version to my feed for other chasers, the comments filled with reasonable, skeptical, and excitable replies. That's the mix storms attract. By morning, everything on the field looked like it had always looked. Flattened rows in the corn, a few broken fence posts, a farmer who squinted at me over his coffee and said he'd seen the funnel but didn't see no lights, boy. I don't blame him. People look at weather and see what they know how to see. I kept the raw files and the timestamps and a jaw that felt a little loose from the thunder. I don't have an answer. The footage is there, and I have the memory of 3 steady points holding inside a thing that should have torn them to pieces. I have a dash cam, a farmer's video, and a radio log that shows a spike at the exact second the flash hits. I slept that night with the laptop closed and the phone on the bedside table. The next day, I drove past the county road where I'd left the car, and the grass bent the same way. People go back to work. Corn keeps swelling. The sky keeps doing what sky does. The lights are still in my camera files, stubborn and inexplicable, and I keep opening them, not because I want an answer, but because I want to remember precisely what looked wrong against everything we think we understand. I was working nights at one of the communications outposts near Groom Lake back in the fall of 2015. I wasn't military, just a contractor handling the audio logs, recording channels, keeping tapes and digital files organized, that sort of thing. Most nights were dull, long stretches of nothing punctuated by routine check-ins or test signals. I didn't mind. The pay was good and the work was quiet. It was a cold, windy evening, just after sunset. The desert air had that sharp, dry bite that gets under your skin when the sun drops behind the hills. I was alone in the comms room, except for the occasional passing guard checking in. The building had no windows, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the faint hum of the equipment running constantly. Around 10:15, I was scanning the incoming audio channels, making sure nothing had scrambled during the last round of tests. Most of it was static or normal radio chatter. That's when I heard it, my name. It wasn't in a clear voice exactly, more like a distorted signal looping through the static. Nathan, Nathan. It repeated over and over, low and fractured, as if the transmission was struggling to maintain itself. I froze, my hand on the tape player. The channel was supposed to be inactive, just a feed from a long-range sensor array. Nothing human was supposed to be broadcasting on it. Hello? I said into the room, though no one would answer. My voice sounded strange, muffled, swallowed up by the hum of the machines. The name kept repeating for maybe 20 seconds, broken, skipping like a scratched record. Then it stopped, leaving only the low static hum in the speakers. I rewound the tape and played it again. The moment it reached the point where I'd heard my name, it was gone. Just static. I thought I'd misheard. Maybe fatigue, maybe my brain filling in words. But then it happened again a few minutes later on a different channel. Same distorted voice, same repetition of my name. I jotted it down on the log, trying to stay calm. Possible signal interference. Here repetition of name, unknown source. I didn't mention it to anyone. You didn't bring these things up if you wanted to keep your job. I replayed the tape later that night in the quiet of the comms room, headphones on. I expected the same fragmented, haunting voice calling my name. But the section that had triggered me earlier was clean. No voice, no distortion. Just normal background static. I checked the other channels. Nothing. Not even a trace of what I'd heard live. My log still had the note from the first recording, but it was useless. I compared timestamps, ran a diagnostic on the equipment. Nothing malfunctioned. For the next few nights, I tried to recreate it, sitting at the same console, scanning the same channels, adjusting levels, everything I could think of. Never happened again. Not on the original tape, not live, not anywhere else. But the feeling didn't leave me. Every time I walked down the hall toward the sleeping quarters, I had this tight, cold sensation in my chest, like someone was listening behind me. I'd glance at the security cameras, see the long, empty corridors, the same flickering fluorescent lights, and still feel it, like a presence lingering just out of view. Once, a week later, I caught a brief glint in one of the cameras. Movement that didn't match anyone I knew was on shift. Just a shadow, pale and flickering along the wall of the comms hallway. By the time I swiveled the monitor, it was gone. No reflection, no person, just the empty corridor. I tried talking to the other contractors subtly, mentioned odd glitches in the recordings, interference, hearing your name in static. They nodded, distracted, didn't ask questions. You could tell they didn't want to talk about it. You learned quickly not to press. I kept my hours, finished out my contract. Nothing else ever came through those channels. Nothing that sounded like a voice, a name, anything unusual. But I knew what I'd heard. There's a line between what the tape shows and what you experience when you're alone, in the quiet, with the desert wind carrying through vents and the low hum of electronics in your ears. Even now, years later, sometimes when I'm alone and hear a scratchy sound in a static-laced channel, I swear I can hear it. My name, just barely, buried under noise I can't explain. But when I try to catch it, replay it, record it, it's gone. Just gone. I never spoke to anyone about it outside that post. Not a single supervisor, not a friend, no one. Some things you don't report because there's nothing to report, nothing to prove, and everything to lose if they take it seriously. I left Nevada not long after that assignment ended. I moved back east, got a different line of work. But every time I think about comms nights, the empty halls, the hum, I remember it. The voice repeating my name, clear in the moment, gone when I tried to hold it. And I don't know why. I still don't. I was working the night shift as an engineer at Area 51 during the late spring. I'd been brought on mainly for routine maintenance, checking HVAC units, doing inspections, replacing filters, that sort of thing. I wasn't supposed to see anything that wasn't on my schedule, but that never stopped me from wandering, especially when the night was quiet and the base felt almost deserted. It was around 2 a.m., and I was doing a rounds check near the northwest hangars. The desert outside was clear, cool for May, wind light enough to carry a fine dust across the gravel roads. Most of the time, nights were quiet here. Too quiet. But that night, as I walked past one of the older administration buildings, I heard it. Faint voices like someone was whispering from far away. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, the kind of fatigue-induced paranoia you get from being up all night. But the whispers were distinct, carrying through the metal ventilation grates above me. I could make out syllables, but not words. Nothing coherent, just tones, almost musical in their rhythm, but urgent, almost pleading. I crouched and put my ear to the nearest vent. The sound shifted slightly, as if whatever was making it had moved within the ducts. I called out, joking to myself, "Hello? Is someone up there?" My voice echoed down the hall, and the whispers didn't stop. They didn't respond directly, but they didn't fade either. I found the maintenance ladder and climbed into the shaft, thinking maybe someone had gotten locked in or was playing some kind of prank. The air inside was dry, colder than the hall below. I crawled a few feet, checking each segment with my flashlight, shining it into every nook. The metal reflected the beam, making strange shadows, but there was nothing. No one. Nothing at all. I paused, thinking maybe the sound had stopped. It hadn't. The whispers continued, now seeming to come from multiple directions within the vent. But every branch I followed led to empty ducts. I started feeling that same prickling sense of being watched. The way you get when you're sure you're alone, but your instincts scream otherwise. I climbed down, more cautious now, the whispers fading into the background but never fully leaving. I shook it off and finished my rounds, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But over the next few nights, it happened again. The whispers started in different areas, sometimes over the main control corridor, sometimes near the storage hangars. Always through the vents, never from open spaces. When I checked, the ducts were empty. The base cameras never showed anything unusual either. I started keeping notes. Time, location, duration, patterns didn't make sense. It didn't follow a schedule. One night, I brought a colleague, Carl, along. He was a night tech, not security. He insisted he wouldn't go inside the ducts. We stayed in the corridor and the whispers began again, soft, echoing off the walls. Carl squinted at me. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, come on, let's follow it," I said. The sound shifted as we moved, following us, echoing from different directions. But the ducts we passed were all empty. One vent I opened with a wrench, a routine check, and I shone the light inside. Nothing. The metal was clean, undamaged, empty. Yet the whispers continued, now lower, almost like someone breathing just behind me. I spun around. Nothing. The hallways were empty, lights steady, cameras blinking. I started noticing other things. The temperature near these vents would drop suddenly. My breath would fog the air, even though the thermostats were showing 72 degrees. Tools I left on counters would be moved back to exact positions I didn't place them. Once, I swear I saw a shadow move across a wall in the reflection of a polished console, but when I turned, there was nothing. I tried recording audio, video, infrared, everything I could think of. All recordings were clean. No whispers, no shadows, nothing abnormal. It was like the base itself was selectively erasing evidence, or maybe my senses were the only ones being tricked. One night, I was alone again. The whispers started in the east wing, faint at first, rising in volume as I approached. I followed them to a maintenance hatch, opened it, and crawled inside. The duct went straight for a few meters, then split into two branches. I checked each branch. Empty. I climbed back out. The whispers followed me down the hall, keeping pace, just behind me, but with no source I could identify. I stopped, trying to steady my breathing. "Hello?" I said again, louder this time. The sound reacted. The whispers stuttered, dropped, and then resumed, as if amused or aware I was acknowledging them. I ran to the nearest exit, reaching the outdoor lights of the desert. I glanced back. The vents were silent again, only the faint wind stirring sand. After that, I started taking a different approach. I would ignore the sounds, move quickly past affected areas, never look inside ducts. The whispers would fade when I was near doors leading outside, but sometimes, even walking past a hallway where the vents were blocked, I felt them. A presence, patient, just out of view. I told a few colleagues in passing, but they either laughed or changed the subject. Some of the older staff hinted at similar experiences but warned me not to make a fuss. "You start asking too many questions," one said. "You start seeing things." Weeks later, I was transferred to day shifts, but the memory lingered. Walking down the base, sometimes the wind would catch the vents just right, and I would hear it again, the faint echo of voices that weren't there, almost calling to me. I'd glance at the grates, half expecting to see something moving. Nothing ever appeared. But the sensation of being followed, of being watched, never fully left. I left the base eventually, got another job far from the desert, but every so often, especially in quiet places, I hear a whisper in the back of my mind, indistinct, urgent, like the desert itself is trying to remind me that some things inside those walls were never meant to be understood. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, thinking I hear a faint hum or whisper just beyond my window. It's never loud, never clear, but it's enough to make me check every corner of the room, half expecting to find a shadow, a reflection, something moving, just like those vents back in Area 51. I never thought a backyard bonfire could make you question reality, but that's exactly what happened last summer. My name's Paula Kent, and I live with my husband Tom and our 12-year-old son Eli on the outskirts of Brattleboro, Vermont. We've got a modest patch of woods behind the house, enough for a fire pit and some chairs, a little garden, and the kind of privacy that makes nights feel genuinely quiet. It was early July, around 9:30. The sky was still a soft blue, streaked with clouds that had held onto the heat of the day. Tom had built the fire while Eli and I set out blankets and marshmallows. The air had that sticky warmth left over from the afternoon, the sort of humidity that clings to your skin, and there was the occasional chirp of crickets just beginning to wake up for the evening. We lit the fire, and the smell of smoke and pine filled the yard. Tom was talking about his week at work. Eli was poking at the flames with a stick, and I was just leaning back, letting the day's stress drift off. The fire crackled, sparks flying up, and everything seemed completely normal. Until I noticed the sparks. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Sparks shoot up all the time, little flickers of light in the night. But then I saw one that didn't drop. It hung, just above the fire, motionless. My eyes darted around, thinking it might be a trick of the wind or my vision. Then another, and another. All the sparks rising as usual, then stopping midair, hovering just above the fire like tiny frozen stars. I blinked and the air seemed to grow heavier. Tom noticed too. "What the hell?" he said, his voice low, uncertain. Eli had stopped poking the fire entirely, his wide eyes glued to the sparks. They weren't moving up or down, swaying with the breeze, nothing. Just suspended. I tried to speak, to ask Tom if he was seeing it too, but my words stuck in my throat. The usual crackle of the fire seemed distant, muted, almost swallowed up. For a second, I couldn't even hear the crickets. I could only see those tiny suspended sparks, and it felt like the night itself had paused. Then it happened. The sparks didn't fall or drift. They vanished. All at once. The glow that had been hovering flickered and disappeared in a single, seamless instant. The silence afterward was absolute. Not quiet in the sense of no wind or distant traffic, but a pressure, like all sound had been held back for a heartbeat and then released. My ears felt full, my heart thudding in a way that made my chest ache. I looked at Tom, and his jaw was tight. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Eli didn't answer. He just stared, a little pale, still gripping his stick. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, some strange reflection, maybe a shadow on the clouds, something explainable. But the sparks had been right there, close enough that I could see the texture of each tiny ember. They couldn't just vanish like that. We sat in silence for a few minutes, staring at the pit. The fire had returned to its normal flicker and glow. The night had its usual hum back. The crickets chirped again. I even laughed a little, nervously, trying to push the unease away. Tom did too, but it felt forced, like we were both aware of something that hadn't left. I tried to continue the night normally. Eli roasted a marshmallow, we talked about school and work, but every time I glanced at the flames, I half expected to see sparks hanging there again. None did, but the memory of them frozen midair stayed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, or that the world had paused for just long enough to let me notice it. Later inside, I kept checking the windows, peering out at the tree line behind our yard. Nothing. No movement, no lights, no signs. But the hairs on my arms kept rising, the way they do when you're aware of something unseen. The next night, I went out to the fire pit again, alone, just to see if anything repeated. Nothing. Just the fire, the smoke, and the familiar night sounds. I stayed for a while, listening, staring, willing myself to believe I'd imagined it, but the feeling remained. The quiet, the hovering sparks, they weren't gone from my mind. Weeks passed, and life went back to normal, or as normal as it gets in a house at the edge of the woods. Eli tells the story sometimes, but he shrugs it off like a dream you can't quite hold on to. Tom hasn't mentioned it since either. I didn't want to make him think I'd lost it. Still, when I pass the fire pit at night now, or when I see sparks rising from a candle or a fireplace, I pause. I watch them for just a second longer than usual, half expecting them to freeze, half expecting that same impossible silence to press in again. And I feel the echo of that night, the way the ordinary became something otherworldly, even if just for a heartbeat. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a trick of the eyes, some atmospheric anomaly, or something else entirely, but I remember it, every detail. The sparks, frozen, the silence afterward, the sense that time had tilted just slightly and the world had held its breath. Even now, the memory is sharp. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that hush again, that unnatural pause, like the air itself is waiting to reveal something beyond sight. And I wonder if one day I'll see it again, or if it was something that only needed to be seen once.